The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the interstate highway, casting shimmering heat waves across the asphalt that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Traffic moved in steady streams, the rhythmic hum of engines creating a monotonous symphony that had become the soundtrack of another ordinary Tuesday in suburban Atlanta. The air conditioning units of passing vehicles worked overtime, their occupants grateful for the refuge from the oppressive Georgia heat that seemed to press down on everything with relentless intensity. Officer Jake Morrison sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, parked strategically beneath the shade of an overpass where he could observe the flow of traffic while remaining relatively cool. His aviator sunglasses reflected the glare of the sun as his eyes scanned each passing vehicle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of spotting violations. Morrison was a 10-year veteran of the Georgia State Patrol, a man whose confidence in his authority had grown with each year of service, sometimes crossing the line into arrogance. At 38 years old, Morrison carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his badge granted him not just authority, but superiority. His uniform was always pristine, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his demeanor carried the unmistakable air of a man who took pleasure in wielding power over others. Today, like most days, he was hunting for infractions, real or imagined, that would justify pulling someone over. The sleek black Mercedes-Benz that glided past his position caught his attention immediately. The vehicle was immaculate, its paint gleaming under the harsh sunlight, moving at exactly the speed limit with the kind of careful precision that suggested its driver was acutely aware of their surroundings. Behind the wheel sat a woman whose posture spoke of confidence and success, her hands positioned perfectly at 10 and 2, her movements smooth and controlled. Dominique Hayes had been driving this route for nearly 15 years, ever since she had taken her position with the Georgia Department of Driver Services. At 42, she was a woman who had climbed the ranks through a combination of exceptional intelligence, unwavering determination, and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the complex world of state government bureaucracy. Her corner office in downtown Atlanta overlooked the very highways she now traveled and the policies that governed every driver's license and identification card in the state bore her signature and her vision. The irony of what was about to unfold would have been almost amusing if it weren't so deeply troubling. Here was a woman who had dedicated her career to creating fair, equitable, and secure identification systems, about to become the victim of the very prejudices those systems were designed to overcome. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he watched the Mercedes continue down the highway. Something about the scene bothered him, though he couldn't quite articulate what it was. Perhaps it was the expensive car driven by a black woman, or perhaps it was simply his ingrained assumption that anyone who looked like her couldn't possibly afford such a vehicle legitimately. Whatever the reason, he felt that familiar stirring of suspicion that had driven so many of his traffic stops over the years. He pulled out behind the Mercedes, his patrol car's engine roaring to life as he accelerated to match its speed. For several miles, he followed at a distance, waiting for any excuse to initiate a stop. The driver maintained perfect speed, used appropriate signals, and demonstrated textbook driving behavior. But Morrison was patient, and he knew that eventually everyone made a mistake. When Dominique's right turn signal flickered on as she prepared to exit the highway, Morrison saw his opportunity. He claimed later that her signal had been activated too late, though the truth was far simpler. He had decided to stop her regardless of any actual violation. The red and blue lights of his patrol car erupted in a dazzling display as he accelerated behind her, his siren wailing briefly to ensure her attention. Dominique felt her heart sink as she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She had been driving for over 2 decades without so much as a parking ticket, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had committed no violation. Nevertheless, she signaled carefully and pulled onto the shoulder of the exit ramp, her hands already moving to the position she knew would be safest when the officer approached. The July heat hit Morrison like a physical wall as he stepped out of his air-conditioned patrol car. Sweat immediately began to form on his forehead as he adjusted his duty belt and approached the Mercedes. Through the tinted windows, he could see the silhouette of the driver, hands visible on the steering wheel, the perfect picture of compliance. Dominique had rolled down her window as soon as she stopped, and she sat perfectly still as Morrison approached. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a white silk blouse, her appearance professional and polished. Her identification was already in her hand, along with her registration and insurance information, prepared with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how these encounters were supposed to proceed. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice calm and respectful as Morrison reached her window. "I have my license, registration, and insurance ready for you." Morrison looked down at her, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, but not the slight smirk that played at the corners of his mouth. The expensive clothes, the luxury car, the polished demeanor, it all struck him as somehow wrong, as if she were playing a role she had no right to inhabit. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over today?" Morrison asked, his tone carrying that particular blend of authority and condescension that had become second nature to him over the years. Dominique considered her response carefully. She knew she had committed no violation, but she also knew that challenging an officer during a traffic stop was rarely productive and often dangerous. "No, sir, I don't believe I was in violation of any traffic laws." Morrison's smirk widened slightly. "Failed to signal in time for your exit. That's a moving violation." He extended his hand toward her. "Let me see your license, registration, and insurance." Dominique handed over the documents, watching as Morrison examined them with exaggerated thoroughness. She noticed how his expression changed as he studied her driver's license, his eyes moving from the plastic card to her face and back again with increasing scrutiny. The Georgia driver's license in Morrison's hand was absolutely pristine. It bore all the correct security features, the holographic overlay that his department had spent months implementing, and the advanced anti-counterfeiting measures that made Georgia IDs among the most secure in the nation. But as Morrison stared at the license, a different narrative began to form in his mind. "This doesn't look right," he said finally, holding the license up to the sunlight as if examining a suspicious bill. "The coloring seems off." Dominique felt a chill run down her spine despite the oppressive heat. "I'm sorry, officer, but there's nothing wrong with my license. It was issued just last month when I renewed it." Morrison turned the license over in his hands, making a show of examining every detail. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 10 years. I know a fake ID when I see one." His voice carried a tone of absolute certainty that brooked no argument. "Officer, I assure you that my license is completely legitimate," Dominique replied, her professional demeanor beginning to strain under the absurdity of the situation. "If you have concerns about its authenticity, I'd be happy to provide additional identification." Morrison looked at her with barely concealed amusement. "Additional fake ID won't help your case, ma'am. What I'm wondering is how you managed to afford a car like this with whatever job you're pretending to have on this fake license." The words hit Dominique like a physical blow. In that moment, she understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about a traffic violation or a questionable license. This was about a police officer who couldn't reconcile her success with his preconceptions about what someone who looked like her should be driving or how she should be living. "Officer Morrison," she said, reading his name badge, "my license is authentic, my employment is legitimate, and my vehicle is legally purchased and properly insured. I've committed no crime, and I'd like to understand exactly what you believe gives you grounds for these accusations." Morrison's expression hardened at her assertive response. "Ma'am, you need to step out of the vehicle. I'm going to need to conduct a more thorough investigation of these documents." Dominique's legal mind raced through her options. She knew her rights, knew that she had no legal obligation to exit her vehicle for a simple traffic stop, especially when she had committed no violation. But she also knew the realities of these encounters. knew that resistance could escalate a situation in dangerous ways. "Officer, I'd prefer to remain in my vehicle if that's acceptable. I'm fully cooperating with your request for documentation, and I'm not under arrest for any crime." Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his duty belt, his posture shifting into a more aggressive stance. "Ma'am, when I give you an order, you follow it. Step out of the vehicle now." The traffic continued to flow past them on the highway, dozens of drivers catching glimpses of the scene but continuing on their way, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of an encounter that would ultimately expose not just one officer's prejudices but an entire system's failure to protect the very people who worked to improve it. Dominique took a slow, deep breath, her mind racing through calculations of risk and consequence. She was a high-ranking state official, a woman whose work touched the lives of millions of Georgia residents every day. She was also a black woman alone on a highway with a police officer whose hostility was becoming more apparent by the moment. "Officer Morrison, I'm going to comply with your request," she said carefully. "But I want to make sure you understand that I'm doing so under protest and I do not consent to any searches of my person or my vehicle." As she reached for her door handle, Morrison stepped back slightly, his hand resting on his weapon in what he probably considered a tactical position, but what looked to any reasonable observer like an unnecessary and threatening gesture. Dominique stepped out of her Mercedes, her movements slow and deliberate, her hands visible at all times. The heat of the asphalt radiated up through her professional heels, and the blazing sun made her blazer feel like a suffocating weight. She stood with her hands at her sides, maintaining the calm dignity that had served her well in countless high-pressure situations throughout her career. Morrison circled around her, studying her appearance with the exaggerated attention of a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. "Expensive clothes, expensive car, fake ID," he said, as if cataloging the elements of a puzzle he was trying to solve. "What kind of work do you claim to do, ma'am?" "I work for the state government," Dominique replied, keeping her voice level despite the growing absurdity of the situation. Morrison let out a short laugh. "State government, huh? Doing what exactly?" "I'm the Director of Policy Development for the Georgia Department of Driver Services." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Morrison stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, amusement, and something approaching mockery. "You expect me to believe," he said slowly, "that you're some kind of high-ranking government official?" "It's not a matter of belief, officer. It's simply fact." Morrison shook his head, his smirk returning with renewed intensity. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you picked the wrong cop to try it with. There's no way someone like you holds any kind of important position in state government." The casual cruelty of his assumption cut deep, but Dominique had spent years learning to maintain her composure in the face of such prejudice. "Officer Morrison, I understand that my position might surprise you, but I can provide you with additional verification if needed." "Oh, I'm sure you've got a whole collection of fake documents," Morrison replied. "But let's start with this fake driver's license. You know it's a felony to possess fraudulent identification documents, don't you?" Dominique felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. What had begun as an unjustified traffic stop was now escalating into accusations of serious criminal activity, all based on Morrison's refusal to believe that her legitimate identification could possibly be real. "Officer, I need you to understand something very clearly," she said, her professional training kicking in despite the personal nature of the attack. "The document you're holding is not only genuine, but it was produced using systems and security features that I personally helped design and implement." Morrison's laughter was sharp and mocking. "Right, and I'm the governor of Georgia. Ma'am, you need to stop making this worse for yourself with these ridiculous lies." The irony was almost unbearable. Here she stood on a Georgia highway, being accused of carrying fraudulent identification by a police officer who was holding a license that bore security features she had personally approved. produced on systems she had helped procure, using policies she had written, and displaying a photograph taken at a facility that operated under her departmental oversight. "Officer Morrison," she tried once more, "if you call the Georgia Department of Driver Services and ask for the Director of Policy Development, they will confirm my identity and my position." Morrison waved dismissively. "Ma'am, I'm not wasting anyone's time with prank calls based on your fantasy stories. What I am going to do is arrest you for possession of fraudulent identification documents, and we'll let the courts sort out whatever other crimes you might be involved in." The words hit Dominique like a thunderbolt. Arrest. She was facing arrest for the crime of carrying legitimate identification while being black and successful. The professional composure she had maintained for decades in the face of countless challenges suddenly felt as fragile as glass. "Officer, please reconsider this course of action," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency for the first time. "You're making a serious mistake that's going to have consequences far beyond what you realize." Morrison interpreted her words as a threat, and his demeanor shifted immediately from mocking to aggressive. "Are you threatening a police officer, ma'am? Because that's another charge I can add to your list." "I'm not threatening anyone," Dominique replied quickly. "I'm simply trying to prevent a misunderstanding that's going to cause problems for everyone involved." But Morrison had already moved past listening. In his mind, he had uncovered a criminal enterprise, caught a sophisticated fraud in action, and demonstrated his superior investigative skills. The fact that his entire theory was built on nothing more than racial prejudice and wounded pride was invisible to him. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he commanded, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for possession of fraudulent identification documents." As the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, Dominique felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. How many others had stood where she stood, victims of assumptions and prejudices that no amount of achievement or success could overcome? How many had faced the same casual dismissal of their humanity, the same refusal to believe that they could be anything more than what bias expected them to be? The afternoon sun continued to beat down mercilessly as Morrison led her toward his patrol car, her expensive heels clicking against the asphalt with each step. Behind them, her Mercedes sat empty on the shoulder, its emergency flashers blinking rhythmically like a beacon marking the spot where justice had taken a sharp turn toward injustice. As Morrison opened the rear door of his patrol car and guided her inside, Dominique caught sight of herself in the reflection of the window. She saw a successful professional woman, a respected government official, a person who had dedicated her career to making the systems of government work better for everyone. But she knew that Morrison saw something entirely different, and that difference would drive everything that followed. The radio crackled to life as Morrison called in his arrest, his voice filled with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Dispatch, I've got one in custody for fraudulent identification documents, requesting transport and processing." Sitting in the back of the patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her back, Dominique closed her eyes and began to prepare for the battle ahead. She knew the system better than almost anyone in the state, knew its strengths and weaknesses, its procedures and protocols, but she was about to experience it from an entirely different perspective, as a defendant rather than a designer. The irony was almost poetic in its completeness. The woman who had spent years working to make identification documents more secure, more reliable, and more resistant to fraud was now being charged with possessing fraudulent identification. The policies she had written, the systems she had implemented, and the procedures she had approved would now be turned against her by a system that refused to see her as anything more than a stereotype. As the patrol car pulled away from the shoulder and merged back into traffic, Dominique began to plan her defense. She had resources, connections, and knowledge that most defendants could only dream of having, but she also knew that none of those advantages would matter if the system was determined to see her as guilty from the start. The wheels of justice were about to turn, and Dominique Hayes was about to discover whether the system she had helped build would protect her or betray her when she needed it most. The Fulton County Jail loomed before them like a concrete monument to the failures of society, its imposing facade designed to intimidate and demoralize anyone unfortunate enough to approach its gates. The building's brutalist architecture cast long shadows across the parking lot, where Morrison's patrol car came to a stop beneath the harsh glare of security lights that burned constantly, day and night, in their effort to eliminate any corner where darkness might hide. Morrison stepped out of the vehicle with the satisfied swagger of a hunter returning with prize game. He had spent the entire 20-minute drive to the jail elaborating on his theory about Dominique's criminal activities, constructing an increasingly elaborate narrative about sophisticated fraud rings and identity theft operations. In his mind, he had uncovered not just a simple case of fake identification, but potentially a major criminal conspiracy that would make his career. The oppressive Georgia heat had not diminished despite the approaching evening, and the asphalt of the jail parking lot radiated stored warmth like a giant griddle. Dominique felt the heat through the soles of her professional shoes as Morrison guided her toward the intake entrance, her hands still cuffed behind her back, her dignity intact despite the humiliating circumstances. Inside the jail, the air conditioning provided blessed relief from the heat, but the atmosphere was heavy with the institutional smell of disinfectant, fear, and human desperation. The walls were painted in that particular shade of institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it for too long. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare that made everyone look sick and tired. Officer Morrison approached the intake desk with the confidence of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times before. Behind the reinforced glass partition sat Sergeant Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of the corrections system whose expression had long ago settled into a mask of professional indifference. She looked up as Morrison approached, her fingers already moving toward the keyboard where she would record the details of another arrest in the endless stream that passed through her station. "What have you got for me today, Morrison?" Santos asked, her voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had heard every story and seen every type of criminal that the justice system could produce. Morrison placed Dominique's confiscated driver's license on the counter with a flourish, as if he were presenting evidence of the crime of the century. "Fraudulent identification documents. This one's been running around with fake ID, driving a stolen Mercedes, probably part of some bigger operation." Santos picked up the license and examined it with practiced eyes. She had processed thousands of identification documents over the years, had seen every type of fake ID that criminal ingenuity could produce, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot fraudulent documents at a glance. What she saw as she examined Dominique's license was a document that was not only genuine, but represented the highest quality of security features that the state of Georgia had ever produced. The holographic overlay caught the light perfectly, displaying the intricate patterns that were nearly impossible to replicate. The microprinting was crisp and clear, the embedded security thread was properly positioned, and the digital photograph showed none of the telltale signs of manipulation that characterized fraudulent documents. Every security feature that Santos had been trained to recognize was present and perfect. "Morrison," Santos said slowly, looking up from the license with a puzzled expression, "this doesn't look fake to me." Morrison leaned against the counter with exaggerated confidence. "Trust me, Santos, I know a fake when I see one. I've been doing this for 10 years. The coloring is off, the texture feels wrong, and there's no way this woman holds the kind of job that would justify driving a car like that." Santos looked past Morrison to where Dominique stood waiting, taking in her professional appearance, her calm demeanor, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself despite the handcuffs and the humiliating circumstances. Something about the entire situation felt wrong to the experienced sergeant, whose instincts had been honed by decades of distinguishing between actual criminals and people who had simply been caught up in the machinery of the justice system. "What does she say she does for work?" Santos asked, turning her attention back to the license and noting the address listed in one of Atlanta's most prestigious neighborhoods. Morrison scoffed. Claims she's some kind of high-ranking government official, director of policy development for the Department of Driver Services, if you can believe that nonsense. Santos felt her eyebrows rise slightly. She had worked with the Department of Driver Services on numerous occasions, coordinating on issues related to identification verification and security protocols. The name Dominique Hayes was not unfamiliar to her, having appeared on official correspondence and policy documents that had crossed her desk over the years. Morrison, Santos said carefully, I think you might want to double-check this before we process the booking. But Morrison was already committed to his narrative, his professional pride now invested in being right about his assessment. Santos, don't let her fancy clothes fool you. These criminals are getting more sophisticated all the time. Process the booking and let the detectives sort it out. Santos looked again at the license, then at Dominique, and then back at Morrison. Her instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong with this arrest, but she also knew that questioning an arresting officer's judgment was a delicate matter that could have professional consequences if handled poorly. All right, she said reluctantly, but I'm noting in the file that the identification documents appear genuine upon initial inspection. As Santos began the booking process, typing information into her computer system, Dominique spoke for the first time since entering the jail. Her voice was calm and professional, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Sergeant Santos, she said, I need you to know that I am indeed employed by the Georgia Department of Driver Services, and I need to make a phone call to notify my department of my status. Morrison turned toward her with obvious irritation. Ma'am, you'll get your phone call when we're ready to give it to you. Right now you need to stay quiet and let us process your arrest. Santos, however, was intrigued by something she had noticed in her computer system. The address listed on Dominique's license had triggered a flag in the database, indicating that the resident was a state government employee with security clearance. This was exactly the kind of detail that separated genuine identification from fraudulent documents. Morrison, Santos said quietly, you need to look at this. She turned her computer monitor so that Morrison could see the screen where Dominique's information had populated not just the basic driver's license database, but had also triggered entries in the state employee database, the security clearance database, and the professional licensing system. This woman isn't just in the driver's license database, Santos explained. She's got entries in multiple state systems, employment records going back 15 years, security clearances, professional certifications. If this is fake, it's the most sophisticated fraud I've ever seen. Morrison stared at the screen, his confidence beginning to waver for the first time since the traffic stop began. The evidence before him was overwhelming, but accepting it would mean admitting that his entire assessment had been wrong, that his arrest was unjustified, and that his professional judgment had been compromised by his own biases. Anyone can hack into computer systems these days, he said weakly, but even he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his own voice. Santos had been watching criminals and honest people for 20 years, and she knew the difference. She looked at Dominique with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people's character through their behavior under stress. What she saw was not a criminal caught in a lie, but a professional woman maintaining her composure in the face of an enormous injustice. Ma'am, Santos said, addressing Dominique directly, what department did you say you work for? The Georgia Department of Driver Services, Dominique replied. I'm the Director of Policy Development. If you call the main number and ask for my office, my assistant can verify my employment and my identity. Santos turned to Morrison with an expression that had shifted from puzzlement to concern. Morrison, I really think we should verify this before we go any further. But Morrison had passed the point of rational decision-making. His ego was now fully invested in proving that he had been right, regardless of the mounting evidence to the contrary. Santos, book her. That's an order. We'll let the lawyers figure out how sophisticated her fraud operation is. The booking process continued with mechanical efficiency, each step designed to strip away dignity and humanity from the person being processed. Dominique's personal effects were cataloged and confiscated, her fingerprints were taken, and her photograph was captured for the jail's records. Through it all, she maintained the professional composure that had served her well throughout her career, even as she felt the system she had helped build closing around her like a trap. The fingerprinting station was staffed by Officer Kevin Thompson, a young corrections officer who took his job seriously and prided himself on his attention to detail. As he rolled Dominique's fingers across the digital scanner, he noticed something unusual about the prints being captured by the system. "Sergeant Santos," Thompson called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "You need to see this." Santos approached the fingerprinting station, where Thompson was staring at his computer screen with a perplexed expression. The digital fingerprint system had not only captured Dominique's prints, but had automatically run them through the state's database of government employees, law enforcement personnel, and security clearance holders. "Her prints are already in the system," Thompson explained. "Multiple entries, state employee database, security clearance database, even the law enforcement cooperation database. According to this, she's been fingerprinted for security clearances at least 6 times over the past 15 years. Santos felt her stomach drop as she realized the full magnitude of what was happening. Morrison had not just arrested an innocent person. He had arrested a high-ranking state government official whose job involved working closely with law enforcement agencies throughout Georgia. "Morrison," Santos called out, her voice urgent now, "we have a serious problem." But Morrison was across the booking area, filling out paperwork and still muttering about sophisticated criminal operations. He either didn't hear Santos or chose to ignore her, continuing with the administrative tasks that would complete Dominique's processing into the jail system. Thompson looked at the information on his screen, then at Dominique, then back at the screen. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "according to our database, you have security clearances with multiple state agencies. How long have you worked for the government?" 15 years, Dominique replied. "I started as a policy analyst and worked my way up to my current position. I've been responsible for driver's license security features, identification document policies, and anti-fraud measures." The irony was so perfect that Thompson actually smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "So you're telling me that Officer Morrison arrested you for having fake identification documents, and you're actually the person who designs the security features that make our identification documents fraud-resistant?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Santos had heard enough. She marched across the booking area to where Morrison was completing his paperwork, her expression grim and determined. The experienced sergeant had seen many questionable arrests over the years, but she had never seen anything quite like this. "Morrison," she said firmly, "we need to stop this booking right now." Morrison looked up from his paperwork with irritation. "Santos, I told you to process the arrest. What's the problem?" "The problem is that you've arrested a high-ranking state government official on charges that are not only false, but are directly contradicted by multiple database entries, security clearances, and employment records going back over a decade." Morrison's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "I don't care what kind of fake records she's managed to create. I know what I saw, and I know a criminal when I see one." Santos stared at him in disbelief. "Morrison, her fingerprints are in our system. Her employment history is in our system. Her security clearances are in our system. Either she's the most sophisticated criminal in the history of Georgia, or you've made a terrible mistake." The booking area had grown quiet as other officers and staff began to gather, drawn by the unusual nature of the conversation. Word was beginning to spread through the jail that something extraordinary was happening, that an arrest had gone terribly wrong in ways that nobody had ever seen before. Dominique watched the scene unfold with a mixture of vindication and sadness. She could see Morrison struggling with the reality that his assumptions had been wrong, that his assessment had been clouded by bias, and that his actions had created a situation that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "Officer Morrison," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I understand that this is difficult for you to accept, but I need you to know that I hold no personal animosity toward you. What I do need is for you to acknowledge that a mistake has been made so that we can begin to correct it." Morrison looked at her with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something approaching fear. The confident police officer who had made the arrest was being replaced by a man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Santos made the decision that would ultimately save Morrison's career, even though he didn't deserve such consideration. "I'm suspending the booking process pending verification of the arrestee's identity and employment status." She picked up her phone and dialed the main number for the Georgia Department of Driver Services. It was after normal business hours, but Santos knew that government agencies maintained emergency contact protocols for situations involving their employees. The phone rang twice before being answered by a security officer at the department's main facility. "Georgia Department of Driver Services Security Desk. This is Sergeant Santos at Fulton County Jail. I need to verify the employment status of someone who claims to be one of your directors. The name is Dominique Hayes, and she says she's the Director of Policy Development." There was a brief pause before the security officer responded. "Ma'am, Director Hayes is indeed employed here. She's one of our senior executives. Is there some kind of emergency involving her?" Santos felt the last of her doubts evaporate. "Sir, I'm going to need to speak with someone from your department's executive team. We have a situation here that requires immediate attention." As Santos continued her phone conversation, confirming details of Dominique's employment and arranging for departmental representatives to come to the jail, Morrison stood alone in the middle of the booking area. The other officers avoided eye contact with him, sensing that he had become radioactive in the way that officers who make career-ending mistakes always do. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, casting their harsh glare over a scene that would become legendary in law enforcement circles. In years to come, Morrison's arrest of Dominique Hayes would be studied in police academies as an example of how personal bias and professional arrogance could combine to create catastrophic failures of judgment. But in that moment, standing in the booking area of Fulton County Jail, Morrison was simply a man who was beginning to understand that his world was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The sleek black SUVs arrived at Fulton County Jail within 45 minutes of Sergeant Santos's phone call, their government license plates and tinted windows announcing the presence of high-ranking state officials even before their occupants emerged. The vehicles moved with the kind of purposeful precision that suggested their passengers were accustomed to dealing with crises, and tonight promised to be a crisis of unprecedented proportions. From the lead vehicle stepped Assistant Director Robert Chen, a tall man in his early 50s whose silver hair and expensive suit spoke of decades spent navigating the treacherous waters of state government bureaucracy. Chen had worked closely with Dominique for over 8 years, and their professional relationship had evolved into a deep mutual respect that transcended the typical office dynamics. When he had received the call about her arrest, his first reaction had been disbelief, followed quickly by a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. The second vehicle disgorged legal counsel Amanda Price, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s whose reputation for protecting state employees from legal challenges was legendary throughout the Georgia government complex. Price carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case that mattered, and tonight she was prepared to bring every resource at her disposal to bear on behalf of her colleague and friend. The third passenger was perhaps the most significant, Deputy Secretary of State James McKinnon, whose presence indicated that this incident had already reached the highest levels of state government. McKinnon was a political animal who understood that the arrest of a high-ranking state official could have ramifications far beyond the immediate circumstances, and he had come prepared to manage not just the legal aspects of the situation, but the inevitable political fallout as well. The trio approached the jail entrance with the measured steps of people who understood the gravity of the situation they were entering. The security cameras tracked their movement, and inside the facility, word spread quickly that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Officers and staff members who had no official involvement in the case found reasons to be in the area, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be discussed for years to come. Officer Morrison stood near the booking desk, his earlier confidence completely evaporated and replaced by a growing sense of dread. The arrival of multiple state government vehicles had not escaped his notice, and the implications were beginning to sink in with devastating clarity. What had started as what he believed to be a routine arrest for fraudulent identification was rapidly spiraling into something far beyond his understanding or control. Sergeant Santos greeted the state officials at the secure entrance to the booking area, her expression a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed embarrassment. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a situation had the potential to destroy careers and end in lawsuits that would cost taxpayers millions of dollars. "Assistant Director Chen," she said, extending her hand as the delegation approached. "I'm Sergeant Santos. We spoke on the phone." Chen's handshake was firm but brief, his attention already focused on the matter at hand. "Sergeant, where is Director Hayes, and what is her current status?" "She's in our holding area, sir. We suspended the booking process after we verified her identity through multiple databases. She hasn't been formally processed into the jail system." Legal counsel Price stepped forward, her briefcase in one hand and a digital tablet in the other. "Has she been read her rights? Has she made any statements? Has she been subjected to any interrogation or questioning beyond the initial arrest?" Santos looked uncomfortable as she considered how to answer. "Ma'am, she was read her rights during the arrest. She's made no statements beyond identifying herself and requesting to notify her department. There's been no formal interrogation." Deputy Secretary McKinnon surveyed the booking area with the calculating eye of a politician assessing a potential disaster. His presence here tonight was both a show of support for Dominique and a clear signal to everyone involved that this incident had implications reaching to the highest levels of state government. "Sergeant Santos," McKinnon said, his voice carrying the authority of his office, "I need to understand exactly how we arrived at this situation. A high-ranking state official was arrested for possessing fraudulent identification documents that she personally helped design. Can you explain to me how that's possible?" Before Santos could answer, Officer Morrison approached the group, his uniform still crisp, but his demeanor betraying the stress of the evening's events. He had been watching the arrival of the state officials with growing apprehension, knowing that his actions were about to face scrutiny from people with the power to end his career. "Sir," Morrison said, addressing McKinnon with forced confidence, "I'm Officer Morrison, the arresting officer. I want to assure you that I followed proper procedures and made the arrest based on reasonable suspicion that the identification documents were fraudulent." Chen turned toward Morrison with an expression that could have frozen water. "Officer Morrison, you arrested the Director of Policy Development for the Georgia Department of Driver Services for possessing fake identification documents. Do you understand the absurdity of that accusation?" Morrison's jaw tightened as he prepared to defend his actions. "Sir, with all due respect, I've been a police officer for 10 years. I know how to identify fraudulent documents, and that license didn't look right to me." Price stepped forward, her legal training evident in the precision of her questions. "Officer Morrison, can you be specific about what made you believe the license was fraudulent? What specific security features did you believe were compromised or missing?" Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to articulate suspicions that had been based more on prejudice than on any actual defects in the document. The coloring seemed off, and the texture felt wrong. "The coloring seemed off?" Chen repeated, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. Officer, that license was produced using the most advanced security printing technology available. The colors are generated by specialized inks that are virtually impossible to replicate. Legal counsel Price opened her briefcase and removed a folder containing technical specifications for Georgia identification documents. Officer Morrison, are you familiar with the security features built into current Georgia driver's licenses? The holographic overlay, the microprinting, the embedded security thread, the ultraviolet reactive inks? Morrison looked at the folder with growing unease. I know about security features, ma'am. Then perhaps you can explain how someone would go about forging a document that contains all of these features when the equipment necessary to produce them costs millions of dollars and is available only to authorized government facilities. The question hung in the air like an indictment. Morrison had no answer because there was no reasonable answer. His assessment of the license had been based not on any actual defects, but on his assumption that someone who looked like Dominique couldn't possibly possess legitimate identification for the kind of life she appeared to be living. Deputy Secretary McKinnon had been observing the exchange with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years managing political crises. What he saw was a situation that could explode into a public relations disaster of epic proportions if not handled carefully. Officer Morrison, McKinnon said, his voice deceptively calm, beyond your assessment of the license itself, what other factors contributed to your decision to make this arrest? Morrison sensed the trap in the question but had no choice but to answer. The suspect was driving an expensive vehicle and wearing expensive clothes that seemed inconsistent with legitimate employment. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread throughout the booking area. Everyone present understood the implications of what Morrison had just admitted. He had made the arrest based not on evidence of any crime, but on his assumption that a black woman couldn't legitimately afford the lifestyle she appeared to be living. Chen's face flushed red with anger. Officer Morrison, are you telling me that you arrested a state government official because you didn't believe she could afford her car and her clothes? Morrison realized too late that he had revealed the true basis for his actions. Sir, that's not what I said. I said it seemed inconsistent. Inconsistent with what? Price interrupted, her legal training focused like a laser on the admission Morrison had just made. Inconsistent with your preconceptions about what kind of person should be driving that car? The booking area had grown completely silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the jail's operations. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing the exposure of the kind of systemic bias that civil rights advocates had been fighting for decades. Assistant Director Chen walked over to where Dominique sat in the holding area, separated from the main booking floor by reinforced glass. Through the partition, he could see her sitting upright in a plastic chair, her professional composure intact despite the handcuffs and the humiliating circumstances of her arrest. Dominique, he said, speaking through the intercom system, we're here to get you out. She looked up at him with a slight smile that carried more sadness than relief. Robert, I hope you understand that this isn't just about getting me out. This is about something much bigger. Chen nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. This incident was a perfect example of how bias and prejudice could corrupt even the most basic functions of law enforcement. How assumptions about race and class could override evidence and reason. Legal counsel Price had been reviewing the arrest report that Morrison had filed, comparing it to the physical evidence and the statements made by various witnesses. What she found was a document that would not survive even the most cursory legal challenge. Sergeant Santos, Price said, I need to inform you that the state of Georgia will be taking immediate action to have these charges dismissed. The arrest was made without probable cause based on false assumptions and in direct violation of Director Hayes's constitutional rights. Santos nodded, having reached the same conclusion herself. Ma'am, we're prepared to release Director Hayes immediately. All of her personal effects will be returned. and we'll provide her with documentation showing that the booking process was suspended. Deputy Secretary McKinnon approached Officer Morrison one final time, his expression grave. "Officer Morrison, I want you to understand the gravity of what has happened here tonight. You have arrested a high-ranking state official based on nothing more than your personal biases and assumptions. This incident will be thoroughly investigated, and there will be consequences." Morrison looked around the booking area, taking in the faces of his colleagues and superiors. He could see the disappointment, the anger, and the professional distance that people maintain when they want to avoid being associated with someone who has made a career-ending mistake. "Sir," Morrison said weakly, "I was just doing my job." McKinnon's response was swift and cutting. "Officer Morrison, your job is to protect and serve all citizens equally, regardless of their race, their appearance, or your personal assumptions about their circumstances. Tonight, you have failed in that duty in the most fundamental way possible." As the state officials worked to secure Dominique's immediate release, word of the incident began to spread beyond the jail. Text messages were sent, phone calls were made, and within hours, news of the arrest would reach reporters, civil rights organizations, and political leaders throughout Georgia. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, casting their harsh glare over a scene that would become a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality in American law enforcement. In the holding area, Dominique Hayes sat quietly, knowing that her ordeal was far from over, but confident that the truth would ultimately prevail. Officer Morrison stood alone near the booking desk, watching as his world began to crumble around him. He had started the day as a confident police officer convinced of his own righteousness and his ability to identify criminals. He was ending it as a man whose career was probably over and whose actions had exposed the kind of systemic bias that destroys trust between law enforcement and the communities they are sworn to serve. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, but they were turning in a direction that Morrison had never anticipated. The hunter had become the hunted. The accuser had become the accused, and the system that he had believed would protect him was preparing to hold him accountable for his actions. As Dominique was processed for release, she knew that this incident would follow both her and Morrison for the rest of their lives. For her, it would become a symbol of resilience and the importance of standing up to injustice. For him, it would become a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing prejudice to override professional judgment. The night was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a reckoning that would expose not just one officer's bias, but an entire system's failure to live up to its highest ideals. The law offices of Coleman and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower in downtown Atlanta, their modern architecture and expensive furnishings reflecting the success of one of Georgia's most prestigious civil rights law firms. Isaiah Coleman had built his reputation over 20 years of fighting injustice, taking on cases that others considered unwinnable and transforming them into landmark victories that changed laws and saved lives. At 55, Coleman carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down institutional power and emerged victorious more times than anyone had a right to expect. His salt and pepper beard framed a face that could shift from gentle compassion to fierce determination in the span of a heartbeat, depending on what the situation required. Today, as he sat across from Dominique Hayes in his corner office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, that determination was burning bright. "Dominique," Coleman said, leaning forward in his leather chair, "I want you to understand something from the beginning. This isn't just about getting you justice for what happened during that traffic stop. This is about exposing a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to continue for far too long." Dominique sat in the client chair, her posture as professional as always, despite the emotional toll of the past week. The incident had become front-page news throughout Georgia, with reporters camping outside her home and her office, all wanting to interview the state official who had been arrested for possessing the very identification documents she had helped create. "Isaiah," she replied, using his first name despite their professional relationship. I appreciate what you're saying, but I need you to know that my primary concern isn't personal revenge. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to others who don't have the resources and connections that I do. Coleman smiled, recognizing in Dominique the same commitment to justice that had driven his own career. That's exactly why I took this case. But to achieve that broader goal, we need to be absolutely methodical in how we approach the legal issues. Officer Morrison's department will try to minimize this incident, claim it was an isolated mistake by one officer. We need to prove that it's part of a larger pattern. On the conference table between them lay boxes of documents that Coleman's staff had been gathering for the past week. Public records requests, personnel files, complaint histories, and incident reports that painted a picture of Morrison's career that was far more troubling than the official record suggested. "Tell me about Morrison's history," Dominique said, gesturing toward the documents. Coleman opened the first box and pulled out a thick folder. Officer Jake Morrison, 10 years with the Georgia State Patrol. On the surface, his record looks fairly clean. A few minor disciplinary actions, nothing that would raise red flags with his supervisors. He paused, opening the folder and spreading several documents across the table. But when you dig deeper, when you look at the pattern of his traffic stops and arrests, a different picture emerges. The document showed a statistical analysis that Coleman's team had prepared, breaking down Morrison's arrest patterns by race, vehicle type, and outcome. The numbers were damning. Over his 10-year career, Morrison had stopped black drivers at a rate nearly 4 times higher than his white colleagues, and his searches of vehicles driven by minorities had a significantly lower rate of producing evidence of actual crimes. "This is the smoking gun," Coleman said, pointing to a particular chart. "Morrison has been engaging in racial profiling for years, but because each individual incident seemed minor and because the complaints were handled at the departmental level, no one ever connected the dots." Dominique studied the numbers with the analytical mind that had made her so effective in her government role. "Isaiah, these statistics are compelling, but how do we prove that Morrison's actions were motivated by racial bias rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns?" Coleman smiled grimly. "That's where your case becomes so important. Morrison didn't just stop you for a traffic violation and then discover what he believed to be fraudulent documents. He made assumptions about you from the moment he saw you driving that Mercedes. His own words to the booking sergeant prove that. He pulled out a transcript of Morrison's statements at the jail, highlighting specific quotes. Morrison told Sergeant Santos that your expensive car and clothes were inconsistent with legitimate employment. He made the arrest not because he found evidence of fraud, but because he couldn't believe that someone who looked like you could legitimately afford to live the way you do. The legal strategy was beginning to take shape in Dominique's mind. "So we're not just proving that the arrest was unjustified. We're proving that it was motivated by racial bias and stereotyping." "Exactly. And that transforms this from a simple false arrest case into a federal civil rights violation under Section 1983. We can seek damages not just for the arrest itself, but for the violation of your constitutional rights." Coleman walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, looking out over the city where both he and Dominique had built their careers fighting for justice in different ways. "Dominique, I need to be honest with you about what we're facing. Morrison's department will fight this case with everything they have. They'll try to destroy your reputation, question your motives, and paint this as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a civil rights violation." Dominique joined him at the window, her reflection in the glass showing the determination that had carried her through years of breaking barriers and challenging systems. "Isaiah, I've been fighting institutional bias my entire career. I'm not going to stop now." The sound of the office door opening interrupted their conversation. Coleman's senior associate, Lisa Rodriguez, entered carrying another box of documents and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something significant. "Isaiah, Dominique," Rodriguez said, "you need to see what we found in Morrison's training records." She placed the new documents on the conference table and opened to a section marked with yellow sticky tabs. Morrison completed bias awareness training 3 times in the past 5 years. Each time, his evaluation scores showed that he understood the legal requirements for equal treatment under the law. Coleman examined the training records with growing interest. This proves that Morrison knew his actions were wrong. He can't claim ignorance or mistake when he's been repeatedly trained on exactly these issues. Rodriguez continued, pulling out additional documents. It gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. Morrison was involved in 2 previous incidents that generated racial bias complaints. Both were handled internally, and both resulted in what the department calls counseling and additional training. Dominique felt a cold anger building in her chest. So, the department knew Morrison had problems with racial bias, provided him with training to address those problems, and then allowed him to continue patrolling with no meaningful oversight? That's exactly what happened, Coleman confirmed. And that means the department itself may bear liability for Morrison's actions. They had notice of his problematic behavior and failed to take adequate corrective action. The legal implications were becoming clearer by the moment. This wasn't just a case against one rogue officer. It was potentially a case against an entire system that had failed to address known problems with racial bias in law enforcement. Rodriguez spread out additional documents showing the department's policies and procedures for handling bias complaints. Their own internal guidelines require progressive discipline for officers who demonstrate patterns of biased behavior. Morrison should have been suspended or terminated after the second complaint. Coleman returned to his chair, his mind already working through the legal arguments they would present. This gives us multiple defendants and multiple theories of liability. We can sue Morrison individually for violating your civil rights, and we can sue the department for failing to properly train and supervise him despite clear warning signs. Dominique sat back in her chair, processing the magnitude of what they were discussing. Isaiah, if we're successful, what kind of impact could this case have beyond my personal situation? Potentially enormous, Coleman replied. A successful lawsuit against both Morrison and his department could force systematic changes in how they handle bias complaints, how they train officers, and how they monitor for patterns of discriminatory behavior. Rodriguez had been reviewing additional documents while Coleman and Dominique talked. There's something else you should know, she said. We've identified at least 12 other individuals who were arrested by Morrison under questionable circumstances over the past 3 years. All minorities, all driving vehicles that Morrison apparently considered too expensive for their race. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Morrison's arrest of Dominique wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of biased policing that had been overlooked or ignored by his superiors. Coleman leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Dominique, I need to prepare you for what's coming. Once we file this lawsuit, Morrison and his department will launch a counterattack designed to discredit you and distract from the real issues. They'll investigate every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use to suggest that you somehow deserved what happened to you. Dominique's response was immediate and firm. Let them investigate. I've spent 15 years in public service, and I've always conducted myself with integrity. I'm not afraid of scrutiny. I know you're not, Coleman said, but I want you to understand that they'll go beyond legitimate investigation. They'll look for ways to suggest that you're somehow anti-police, that you have an agenda, that you're using this incident for personal gain. Rodriguez added, We're already seeing some of that in the media. There have been anonymous quotes from department sources suggesting that you were uncooperative during the traffic stop, that you escalated the situation unnecessarily. Dominique felt the familiar surge of anger that came with being blamed for the actions of others, but she kept her voice level. So we're already seeing the standard playbook: blame the victim, question the victim's motives, and distract from the officer's misconduct. Exactly, Coleman confirmed. But we're prepared for that. We have the video evidence from the bystander, we have the testimony of multiple jail personnel who witnessed Morrison's statements, and we have the statistical evidence of his pattern of biased behavior. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the office windows, casting long shadows across the conference table, covered with documents that would form the foundation of their case. Dominique looked at the papers, seeing not just evidence of injustice, but an opportunity to create meaningful change. "Isaiah," she said finally, "I want to move forward with the lawsuit, not just for me, but for everyone who has been victimized by this kind of behavior and didn't have the resources to fight back." Coleman nodded, having expected nothing less from a woman who had built her career on challenging unfair systems. "Then let's get to work. We have a case to build and a system to change." As they began the detailed work of preparing their legal strategy, all three of them understood that they were embarking on more than just a lawsuit. They were launching a campaign for justice that would test not just the legal system's commitment to civil rights, but society's willingness to confront the uncomfortable realities of racial bias in law enforcement. The battle was about to begin, and the outcome would reverberate far beyond the courtroom where it would ultimately be decided. The Channel 7 newsroom buzzed with the electric energy that only came with a story that had all the elements of a perfect media storm. Racial injustice, government incompetence, and irony so perfect it seemed scripted for television. News director Sandra Williams stood before the wall of monitors that displayed feeds from across the Atlanta metropolitan area, watching as her competitors scrambled to catch up with a story that her station had broken 12 hours earlier. The initial report had been relatively straightforward. A high-ranking state official arrested for possessing fraudulent identification documents that she had actually helped design. But as reporters dug deeper into the story, it had evolved into something much more complex and explosive, touching on issues that went to the heart of American society's ongoing struggle with racial bias and police accountability. "Sarah," Williams called to her senior investigative reporter, "what's the latest from your sources at the department?" Sarah Mitchell looked up from her computer, where she had been transcribing interviews with current and former state patrol officers. "Sandra, this story keeps getting bigger. I've got 3 officers willing to go on record about Morrison's history of questionable stops, and 2 more who will talk off the record about a culture of racial profiling that goes well beyond one officer." The implications were staggering. What had started as the story of one bad arrest was becoming an exposé of systemic problems within one of Georgia's most visible law enforcement agencies. Mitchell had been working around the clock, following leads that led to more leads, uncovering a pattern of behavior that suggested Morrison was not an isolated bad actor, but part of a larger problem. On the main monitor, CNN was running its 3rd segment of the day about the incident, with a panel of experts discussing the broader implications of racial bias in traffic stops. The story had gone national within 48 hours, with civil rights organizations using it as an example of exactly the kind of discriminatory policing they had been fighting for decades. Williams watched the CNN segment with the satisfaction of a news director who knew her station was ahead of a story that would dominate the news cycle for weeks. "Sarah, I want you to focus on the department's response. They're going to try to isolate Morrison, make this about one officer's mistake rather than acknowledging any systemic problems." Mitchell nodded, already thinking about her next round of interviews. "I've got a meeting with the department's public information officer this afternoon. They're definitely in damage control mode." Across town, at the offices of the Georgia State Patrol, Captain Linda Foster sat behind her desk reviewing talking points that the department's legal team had prepared for media interviews. Foster had been with the patrol for 22 years, working her way up through the ranks in an organization that had been slow to adapt to changing social expectations about policing and accountability. The Dominique Hayes incident had caught the department completely off guard. Internal investigations of Morrison's conduct were routine, handled quietly through administrative channels that rarely attracted public attention. But when the arrestee turned out to be a high-ranking state official whose job involved working closely with law enforcement agencies, the normal procedures for damage control had proven inadequate. "Captain Foster," her secretary's voice came through the intercom. "The deputy commissioner is here for your meeting." Foster straightened her uniform jacket and prepared to face her superior's questions about how an incident like this could have occurred under her command. Deputy Commissioner Harold Stone was a political appointee who understood that public perception was often more important than underlying facts when it came to managing controversies. Stone entered Foster's office with the grim expression of a man who had spent the morning fielding calls from reporters, legislators, and civil rights organizations. At 62, he had thought he had seen every type of crisis that law enforcement could face. But the Hayes incident represented a new category of public relations disaster. "Linda," Stone said, settling into the chair across from Foster's desk, "I need to understand how we got here. Morrison has been under your direct supervision for 3 years. How did we miss the warning signs?" Foster had been dreading this conversation since the story broke. "Commissioner, Morrison's personnel file shows some minor disciplinary issues, but nothing that would have predicted this kind of incident. His arrest statistics were within normal parameters." Stone opened the folder he had brought with him, revealing the statistical analysis that Coleman's legal team had compiled and leaked to reporters. "Linda, these numbers tell a different story. Morrison stopped minority drivers at nearly 4 times the rate of his colleagues. How do you explain that?" Foster looked at the statistics with growing unease. Seen individually, each of Morrison's stops had seemed justified, but the pattern revealed in the aggregate data was undeniably troubling. "Commissioner, I can't explain those numbers without conducting a more thorough investigation." "That investigation should have been conducted years ago," Stone replied sharply. "We had complaint reports, we had training records showing repeated bias awareness courses, and we had supervisory reports that should have raised red flags. Someone in this chain of command failed to connect the dots." The conversation was interrupted by Foster's phone ringing. She looked at the caller ID and winced. "Commissioner, it's the governor's office." Stone nodded grimly. "Put it on speaker." The voice that came through the phone belonged to Chief of Staff Margaret Thompson, whose tone carried the barely controlled frustration of someone managing a political crisis. "Deputy Commissioner Stone, the governor needs answers. This Hayes incident is dominating the news cycle, and we're getting calls from legislators demanding investigations." Stone had been expecting this call since the story broke. "Margaret, we're conducting a full internal investigation of Officer Morrison's conduct and reviewing our procedures for handling bias complaints." "That's not going to be sufficient," Thompson replied. "The governor is facing questions about whether state law enforcement agencies are properly training officers and investigating complaints of discriminatory policing. This isn't just about one officer anymore." Meanwhile, at the offices of the Georgia NAACP, Executive Director Marcus Johnson was fielding calls from reporters and community activists who saw the Hayes incident as validation of complaints they had been making for years about biased policing. Johnson had spent 2 decades fighting discrimination in various forms, but this case presented a unique opportunity to focus public attention on issues that typically remained hidden in statistical reports and legal briefs. "This incident is particularly significant," Johnson told a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, "because it involves someone who couldn't be dismissed or marginalized in the ways that victims of police bias typically are." Director Hayes is a respected government official with an impeccable record. Her experience exposes the reality that racial profiling affects people at every level of society. The reporter, veteran journalist David Kim, pressed for more specifics. "Mr. Johnson, what kind of response are you expecting from state officials?" Johnson had been preparing for this question since the story broke. "We expect a full investigation not just of Officer Morrison, but of the systemic failures that allowed his behavior to continue for years. We want to see policy changes that ensure officers who demonstrate patterns of biased behavior are removed from patrol duties." Across the city at Dominique's suburban home, the front yard had been transformed into an impromptu media encampment. Television trucks lined the street, their satellite antennas reaching toward the sky like metal trees, while reporters did stand-up segments with her house as a backdrop. The unwanted attention had forced Dominique to enter and leave through her garage, avoiding the cameras and microphones that seemed to be everywhere. Inside the house, Dominique sat at her kitchen table reviewing media coverage of the incident on her laptop. The stories ranged from straightforward news reports to opinion pieces that used her experience to discuss broader issues of racial justice and police accountability. Some of the coverage was supportive, portraying her as a victim of clear injustice, but other pieces questioned her motives for pursuing legal action. Her doorbell rang, and she could see through the window that it was another reporter seeking an interview. She had given one statement through her lawyer and had no intention of feeding the media frenzy that had developed around her personal situation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Isaiah Coleman. "Dominique, the department just released Morrison's personnel file to reporters. We need to talk." The release of Morrison's personnel file represented an escalation in the public relations battle surrounding the case. By making the information public, the department was attempting to control the narrative by providing selected details about Morrison's career and the disciplinary actions taken against him. Coleman's law firm had obtained the same records through legal discovery, and they painted a picture that was more complex than either the department's official statements or the media coverage had suggested. Morrison had indeed received multiple bias awareness training sessions, but he had also received commendations for arrest statistics that, viewed in light of the current incident, took on a more troubling significance. The afternoon news broadcasts led with the story, featuring interviews with former colleagues of both Dominique and Morrison. The contrasts were stark. Dominique's colleagues uniformly described her as professional, competent, and dedicated to fairness in government services, while Morrison's colleagues offered more guarded assessments that suggested ongoing concerns about his approach to policing. On social media, the story had generated hashtags and viral videos that spread far beyond Georgia's borders. The incident became a symbol for broader conversations about racial justice, with celebrities and activists using it to highlight similar cases that had received less attention. But the media coverage also revealed the deep divisions in public opinion about policing and racial issues. Comment sections on news websites filled with heated debates between those who saw the incident as clear evidence of systemic bias and those who defended Morrison's actions as reasonable responses to suspicious behavior. The polarization was perhaps most evident in the coverage provided by different news outlets. Liberal-leaning publications framed the story as an example of the racial profiling that civil rights groups had long criticized, while conservative outlets focused on Morrison's length of service and suggested that the incident was being blown out of proportion for political purposes. By the end of the week, the Hayes incident had generated more media coverage than any single law enforcement controversy in Georgia's recent history. Editorial boards at major newspapers had weighed in with calls for reform, while radio talk shows featured heated discussions between callers who disagreed fundamentally about what the incident represented. The story had also attracted the attention of national civil rights organizations who saw it as an opportunity to advance broader policy goals related to police accountability and bias training. Press conferences were scheduled, position papers were drafted, and legislative proposals were prepared that would use the Hayes incident as a catalyst for more sweeping reforms. For Dominique, the media attention was both validating and exhausting. She had spent her career working behind the scenes to improve government services, and the sudden spotlight on her personal experience was difficult to navigate. But she also understood that the publicity surrounding her case could help prevent similar incidents from happening to others who lacked her resources and connections. The media storm showed no signs of abating as the case moved toward formal legal proceedings. If anything, the coverage was intensifying as reporters uncovered new details about Morrison's history and the department's handling of previous complaints about his conduct. As Dominique prepared for the legal battle ahead, she knew that it would be fought not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion, where competing narratives about justice, fairness, and the role of law enforcement would be tested against the facts of what had happened on a Georgia highway on one hot July afternoon. The conference room at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Decatur had been transformed into a command center for what had become one of the most high-profile internal investigations in the agency's history. Maps, charts, and timelines covered the walls, while boxes of documents occupied every available surface. At the center of it all sat Special Agent Lisa Chen, a 15-year veteran of complex investigations who had been personally assigned by the director to lead the inquiry into the Hayes incident and the broader questions it had raised about policing practices. Chen had built her reputation on meticulous attention to detail and an unwillingness to accept easy answers to difficult questions. The Hayes case presented challenges that went beyond typical internal affairs investigations, touching on issues of constitutional rights, departmental culture, and the statistical analysis of arrest patterns that required expertise in multiple fields. "Agent Rodriguez," Chen called to her junior partner, "what did you find in Morrison's vehicle records?" Agent Tony Rodriguez looked up from his laptop, where he had been analyzing data from Morrison's patrol car over the past 3 years. The modern patrol vehicles were equipped with GPS tracking systems, dashboard cameras, and computer terminals that created detailed electronic records of every stop, every interaction, and every decision made by the officer. "Agent Chen, the patterns are even more troubling when you look at the electronic data," Rodriguez replied, turning his screen so she could see the analysis he had compiled. Morrison's GPS records show that he spent a disproportionate amount of time patrolling areas with higher minority populations, even when those areas were outside his assigned sector. The implications were significant. If Morrison had been actively seeking out opportunities to stop minority drivers, it would suggest that his biased behavior was not just unconscious prejudice, but deliberate discrimination. Chen studied the GPS data, noting the patterns that showed Morrison's patrol car consistently moving toward areas where he would be more likely to encounter Black and Hispanic drivers. "Tony, cross-reference this GPS data with his arrest records. I want to see if there's a correlation between his location choices and his arrest patterns." As Rodriguez worked on the data analysis, Chen turned her attention to another aspect of the investigation that was proving equally troubling. On her desk lay personnel files for Morrison's supervisors over the past 5 years, including Captain Foster and 2 previous commanders who had overseen his work. The supervisory records revealed a pattern of missed opportunities and ignored warning signs that suggested systemic failures at multiple levels of the department's hierarchy. Morrison's bias awareness training had been documented, but there was no evidence that anyone had followed up to ensure that the training was effective or that his behavior had changed. Chen's phone rang, interrupting her review of the supervisory records. The caller ID showed that it was Director James Walsh, the head of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, calling from his office in Atlanta. "Agent Chen." Walsh's voice carried the weight of someone who had been fielding calls from politicians and reporters all morning. "I need a preliminary assessment of what you're finding. The governor's office is asking for updates every 6 hours." Chen had been expecting this call since the investigation began. "Director, what we're uncovering goes well beyond Officer Morrison's individual actions. We're seeing evidence of systemic failures in supervision, training, and complaint handling that allowed problematic behavior to continue for years." Walsh was silent for a moment, processing the implications of what Chen had just told him. "Agent Chen, I need you to be very careful about how you document these findings. This investigation is going to be scrutinized by everyone from federal civil rights attorneys to legislative oversight committees." "Understood, Director. But I need you to know that the evidence is overwhelming. This isn't a case where we can minimize the scope of the problems we've identified." After ending the call with Director Walsh, Chen returned to the task of reconstructing Morrison's career pattern through electronic records and witness interviews. What emerged was a picture of an officer whose behavior had grown progressively more problematic over time, emboldened by a supervisory system that failed to provide adequate oversight. Agent Rodriguez had completed his analysis of the GPS and arrest data, and the results were damning. Agent Chen, Morrison made traffic stops in areas with majority-minority populations at a rate nearly 6 times higher than would be expected based on his patrol assignments, and his arrest rates in those areas were significantly higher than his colleagues working the same regions. Chen studied the data visualization that Rodriguez had created, which showed Morrison's patrol patterns as colored lines on a map of his assigned territory. The lines clustered heavily around areas with higher concentrations of Black and Hispanic residents, even when those areas required him to drive out of his way from his assigned routes. Tony, have you been able to identify any of Morrison's previous arrestees who might be willing to be interviewed? Rodriguez nodded, pulling out a list of names and contact information. I've identified 15 individuals who were arrested by Morrison over the past 3 years, under circumstances similar to the Hayes incident. Most were traffic stops that escalated to arrests for minor violations or charges that were later dismissed. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Morrison had been conducting what amounted to fishing expeditions, stopping minority drivers for minor or questionable violations and then searching for reasons to make arrests. The fact that many of the charges were later dismissed suggested that the arrests had been unjustified from the beginning. Chen's attention was drawn to a particular case file that Rodriguez had flagged for special attention. "Tell me about this one," she said, pointing to the folder marked with a red tab. Terrence Johnson, arrested by Morrison 18 months ago for allegedly driving with a suspended license. The problem is that Johnson's license wasn't actually suspended, and the DMV records show no basis for Morrison's belief that it was. Chen opened the Johnson file and reviewed the arrest report, the booking photos, and the subsequent court records that showed all charges being dismissed. The case bore striking similarities to the Hayes incident. A Black professional driving a luxury vehicle stopped for a questionable violation, arrested based on Morrison's unfounded suspicions about fraudulent documents. "Tony, have you contacted Mr. Johnson?" "I have. He's willing to be interviewed, and he's still angry about what happened to him. He said he tried to file a complaint against Morrison, but the department told him that since the charges were dismissed, no further action was warranted." The failure to investigate Johnson's complaint represented another systemic breakdown that had allowed Morrison to continue his pattern of biased policing. Each dismissed complaint, each lack of follow-up, each failure to connect individual incidents into a broader pattern had contributed to the environment that made the Hayes incident inevitable. Chen's investigation was also revealing troubling information about the department's training programs and supervisory procedures. The bias awareness training that Morrison had completed multiple times was generic and superficial, focusing more on avoiding legal liability than on actually changing officer behavior. "Agent Rodriguez, I want you to interview the trainers who conducted Morrison's bias awareness sessions. I want to know what kind of assessment they did to determine whether the training was effective." As Rodriguez left to conduct those interviews, Chen turned her attention to what might be the most disturbing aspect of the entire investigation: the role played by Morrison's supervisors in allowing his behavior to continue. Captain Linda Foster's personnel file showed that she had been aware of at least 3 complaints against Morrison involving allegations of racial bias. In each case, Foster had handled the complaint through informal counseling and additional training, never escalating the issues or conducting the kind of thorough investigation that might have revealed the pattern of problematic behavior. Chen's phone buzzed with a text message from Director Walsh. "Chen, the U.S. Attorney's Office is asking questions about potential federal civil rights violations. We may need to coordinate with federal investigators. The involvement of federal authorities would add another layer of complexity to the investigation, but it also reflected the seriousness with which the Hayes incident was being viewed at the highest levels of law enforcement. Federal civil rights prosecutions of police officers were relatively rare, requiring clear evidence of willful violations of constitutional rights. Chen walked to the window of the conference room, looking out over the Atlanta metropolitan area where Morrison had conducted his biased policing for nearly a decade. Somewhere out there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of people who had been stopped, searched, arrested, or harassed by an officer whose supervisors had failed to control his discriminatory behavior. The Hayes incident had exposed not just one officer's misconduct, but a systemic failure that had allowed that misconduct to flourish. Chen's investigation was documenting not only what Morrison had done, but how the department's failures had enabled him to do it. Her computer chimed with an incoming email from the laboratory division, reporting the results of their analysis of Dominique's driver's license. As expected, the document was not only genuine, but contained every security feature that the state of Georgia incorporated into its identification documents. The lab report included detailed photographs showing the holographic overlays, the microprinting, the embedded security threads, and the ultraviolet reactive inks that made Georgia licenses among the most secure in the nation. Every feature that Morrison claimed looked off or wrong was present and perfect, produced by equipment that cost millions of dollars and was available only to authorized government facilities. Chen added the lab report to her growing file of evidence that would ultimately be used not only in the internal investigation but in the federal civil rights case and the civil lawsuit that Isaiah Coleman was preparing on Dominique's behalf. The afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of a team of federal investigators from the FBI's Civil Rights Division, led by Special Agent Rebecca Martinez. Martinez had spent 10 years investigating police misconduct cases, and her presence indicated that the federal government was taking the Hayes incident very seriously. "Agent Chen," Martinez said as she entered the conference room, "we understand you've been conducting a comprehensive investigation of Officer Morrison's conduct and the department's supervisory failures." Chen nodded, gesturing toward the boxes of documents and the wall charts that mapped out Morrison's pattern of biased policing. "Agent Martinez, what we've found goes well beyond a single incident. We're looking at years of discriminatory behavior that was enabled by systemic failures in supervision and accountability." Martinez studied the evidence displays with the practiced eye of someone who had seen similar patterns in police departments across the country. "Agent Chen, this looks like a textbook case of the kind of institutional failures that lead to federal intervention under consent decrees. The possibility of federal oversight of the Georgia State Patrol represented the most serious potential consequence of the Hayes incident. Federal consent decrees were imposed when police departments demonstrated persistent patterns of constitutional violations, requiring years of court-supervised reforms and independent monitoring. "Agent Martinez," Chen said, "I need to show you something that might be particularly significant for your investigation." She led Martinez to a computer terminal where Rodriguez had compiled his statistical analysis of Morrison's arrest patterns. The data showed not only Morrison's individual bias, but suggested that he was not alone in the department. These numbers show that Morrison's patterns of discriminatory policing were extreme, but they also show that several other officers in his unit had similar, though less pronounced, patterns of stopping minority drivers at disproportionate rates. Martinez studied the statistics with growing concern. "Agent Chen, this suggests that Morrison's behavior was not just tolerated, but may have been part of a broader culture within his unit or the department as a whole." The implications were staggering. If federal investigators determined that the Georgia State Patrol had a pattern or practice of discriminatory policing, it could result in a consent decree that would fundamentally reshape how the department operated, trained its officers, and investigated complaints. As the day wore on, more evidence continued to accumulate. Interviews with Morrison's former arrestees revealed a pattern of stops that began with minor or questionable traffic violations and escalated based on the officer's assumptions about the driver's criminal activity or immigration status. The investigation was also revealing the human cost of Morrison's biased policing. Several of his former arrestees had lost jobs due to time spent in jail on charges that were later dismissed. Others had incurred legal expenses defending against false charges. The damage extended beyond the immediate victims to their families and communities who learned to view law enforcement with suspicion and fear. Chen's final task of the day was to review the recorded interviews with Morrison himself, conducted by internal affairs investigators immediately after the Hayes incident. The recordings revealed an officer who remained convinced that his actions had been justified despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "I know what I saw," Morrison had told the investigators. "That woman was driving a car she couldn't afford, wearing clothes that didn't fit her situation, and carrying identification that looked suspicious. Any experienced officer would have done the same thing." The recordings captured Morrison's voice as he defended his actions, his tone revealing not remorse or self-reflection, but continued certainty that he had been right to arrest Dominique Hayes. Even when confronted with evidence that her identification was genuine, Morrison maintained that his suspicions had been reasonable. As Chen prepared to leave the office that evening, she reflected on what the investigation had revealed about the challenges facing law enforcement in a diverse democracy. Morrison's actions had not occurred in a vacuum, but had been enabled by supervisors who failed to recognize warning signs, and by a system that prioritized loyalty over accountability. The Hayes incident had become a catalyst for examining not just one officer's misconduct, but the broader questions of how police departments train officers, investigate complaints, and ensure that constitutional rights are protected for all citizens regardless of their race or appearance. Chen's investigation was nearing completion, but its impact was just beginning. The evidence she had gathered would form the foundation for prosecutions, lawsuits, and policy reforms that would reshape law enforcement practices not just in Georgia, but potentially across the country. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Chen reviewed her notes one final time, knowing that tomorrow would bring new revelations and new questions about how the justice system had failed Dominique Hayes and so many others. The investigation had revealed the truth about what happened on that July afternoon, but the harder work of ensuring that it never happened again was just beginning. The imposing limestone facade of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in Atlanta cast long shadows across the morning sun as a parade of black government SUVs pulled into the secured parking garage. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had arrived in force, bringing with them the full authority of the federal government to investigate what had become one of the most high-profile cases of alleged police misconduct in recent Georgia history. Assistant Attorney General Patricia Williams stepped out of the lead vehicle, her silver hair catching the artificial lighting of the garage as she surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 3 decades prosecuting civil rights violations. Williams had built her reputation on complex cases that exposed systemic failures in law enforcement, and the Hayes incident presented all the elements of a landmark federal civil rights prosecution. "Agent Martinez," Williams said to the FBI investigator who had been coordinating with state authorities, "I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. The preliminary reports suggest this goes well beyond a single officer's misconduct." Martinez led Williams and her team toward the secure elevator that would take them to the conference room where they would review the evidence that had been compiled over the past month. The federal investigation had been triggered not just by the Hayes incident itself, but by the pattern of behavior that state investigators had uncovered in their examination of Morrison's career. "Ms. Williams," Martinez replied as they entered the elevator, "what we found is a textbook example of how individual bias can be enabled and amplified by systemic failures in supervision, training, and accountability." Officer Morrison's conduct was egregious, but the department's response to previous complaints was equally problematic. The conference room on the 15th floor had been transformed into a war room for the federal investigation, with evidence displays covering the walls and multiple computer workstations set up for data analysis. The scope of the investigation had expanded far beyond the Hayes incident to encompass Morrison's entire career and the supervisory failures that had allowed his discriminatory behavior to continue. Williams studied the evidence displays with the intensity of a prosecutor preparing for the most important case of her career. Statistical charts showed Morrison's traffic stop patterns, arrest rates, and complaint history in stark visual form. Photographs of evidence, transcripts of recorded interviews, and timelines of supervisory failures created a comprehensive picture of institutional dysfunction. "Agent Martinez," Williams said, "walk me through the evidence for a federal civil rights violation." Martinez approached the first evidence display, which showed a map of Morrison's patrol area overlaid with demographic data and the locations of his traffic stops. "Ms. Williams, Morrison conducted traffic stops in majority-minority areas at a rate nearly 8 times higher than his assigned patrol schedule would suggest. His GPS records showed deliberate deviation from assigned routes to target areas with higher concentrations of Black and Hispanic residents. The pattern was so clear that it would be difficult for any jury to view it as coincidental. Morrison had not simply exhibited unconscious bias in his policing, he had actively sought out opportunities to stop minority drivers, even when doing so required him to leave his assigned patrol area. Williams moved to the next display, which showed Morrison's arrest statistics broken down by race and the outcomes of those arrests. "Agent Martinez, what do these conviction rates tell us about the quality of Morrison's arrests?" "Ms. Williams, Morrison's arrests of minority drivers resulted in convictions at a rate significantly lower than both his arrests of white drivers and the department average. Many of the charges were dismissed entirely, suggesting that the arrests lacked probable cause from the beginning. The low conviction rate was particularly damaging evidence because it suggested that Morrison was making arrests based on suspicion and bias rather than evidence of actual criminal activity. Federal civil rights prosecutions required proof that an officer willfully violated someone's constitutional rights, and the pattern of unjustified arrests provided that proof. Williams turned her attention to perhaps the most damning evidence, the recordings of Morrison's own statements about his policing philosophy. During his internal affairs interviews, Morrison had made comments that revealed his fundamental assumptions about race, class, and criminal behavior. "I've been doing this job for 10 years, Morrison's voice came through the conference room speakers as Williams reviewed the recorded interviews. "You develop instincts about who belongs where and who doesn't. When you see someone driving a car they shouldn't be able to afford, living in a neighborhood they don't belong in, you investigate." Williams paused the recording, her expression grim. "Agent Martinez, Morrison just articulated a policing philosophy based entirely on racial and economic stereotyping. He's essentially admitting that he makes decisions about who to stop based on his assumptions about what kind of person should be driving what kind of car." The federal prosecutors had been building their case systematically, documenting not just Morrison's individual actions but the broader pattern of departmental failures that had enabled his conduct. Captain Foster's personnel file revealed multiple missed opportunities to discipline Morrison or investigate complaints about his behavior. Williams reviewed Foster's supervisory notes, which showed a disturbing pattern of minimizing complaints and avoiding the kind of thorough investigation that might have revealed Morrison's discriminatory behavior. "Agent Martinez, Captain Foster received at least 5 formal complaints about Morrison's conduct over 3 years. In each case, she handled the matter through informal counseling rather than formal disciplinary action." "That's correct, Ms. Williams. And in at least 2 cases, the complainants specifically alleged racial bias in Morrison's conduct. Foster's response was to send Morrison to additional bias awareness training, but there's no evidence that she followed up to determine whether the training was effective. The failure to properly investigate complaints represented a separate violation of federal civil rights law. When police supervisors fail to investigate credible allegations of discriminatory policing, they can be held liable for enabling constitutional violations by their subordinates. Williams's attention was drawn to a particular file that had been flagged by investigators as particularly significant. The case involved Jerome Washington, a black attorney who had been stopped by Morrison for allegedly speeding on Interstate 285. The traffic stop had escalated when Morrison claimed that Washington's driver's license looked suspicious, leading to an arrest that was later thrown out by a judge who found no basis for Morrison's actions. "Agent Martinez, tell me about the Washington case." Martinez opened the file and spread out the relevant documents. Mr. Washington was driving home from his law office when Morrison stopped him for allegedly exceeding the speed limit by 5 miles per hour. Morrison claimed that Washington's license looked fraudulent and arrested him for possession of false identification. Williams studied the arrest report, noting the similarities to the Hayes incident. "Let me guess. Washington's license was completely legitimate, and Morrison's suspicions were based on nothing more than his assumption that a black man couldn't legitimately be driving an expensive car." Exactly. Washington filed a formal complaint with the department alleging that Morrison had profiled him based on his race. Captain Foster's response was to send Morrison to a 4-hour bias awareness class and close the complaint as resolved through training. The Washington case was particularly damaging because it showed that the Hayes incident was not an isolated occurrence, but part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been ignored by Morrison's supervisors. Washington's willingness to testify about his experience would provide powerful evidence for federal prosecutors. Williams moved to the final evidence display, which showed the department's training records and policies related to bias prevention and complaint investigation. What she found was a system that was designed more to protect the department from liability than to actually prevent discriminatory policing. "Agent Martinez, these training records show that Morrison completed bias awareness training 4 times over 6 years, yet his discriminatory behavior continued and even escalated. What does that tell us about the effectiveness of the department's training program?" Martinez had been analyzing the training materials and had reached troubling conclusions about their adequacy. "Miss Williams, the training was generic and superficial, focused primarily on legal compliance rather than changing behavior. There was no individualized assessment of officers who had received complaints, and no follow-up to determine whether the training had any impact. The inadequate training program represented another systemic failure that had contributed to the environment in which Morrison's misconduct flourished. Federal courts had consistently held that generic training programs were insufficient to address patterns of discriminatory behavior by individual officers. Williams's review of the evidence was interrupted by the arrival of United States Attorney Michael Davidson, whose jurisdiction included all federal prosecutions in Georgia. Davidson had been monitoring the investigation closely, understanding that a successful prosecution could have national implications for how federal authorities addressed police misconduct. "Pat," Davidson said, using Williams's nickname, "what's your assessment of our prospects for a successful prosecution?" Williams gestured toward the evidence displays that surrounded them. "Mike, this is one of the strongest civil rights cases I've seen in 20 years. We have clear evidence of discriminatory policing, documented supervisory failures, and Morrison's own admissions about his biased assumptions." Davidson studied the statistical evidence, noting the stark disparities in Morrison's treatment of minority drivers. "Pat, do we have enough evidence to proceed against the supervisors as well as Morrison?" "I believe we do. Captain Foster's failure to investigate credible complaints about Morrison's discriminatory behavior constitutes deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. Deputy Commissioner Stone's approval of Foster's handling of those complaints could make him liable as well. The prospect of prosecuting multiple officials within the Georgia State Patrol represented an escalation that would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Federal prosecutions of police supervisors were relatively rare, requiring proof that the supervisors had deliberately ignored constitutional violations by their subordinates. Williams's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant in Washington. "Director wants update on Georgia case. Congressional inquiries coming in." The Hayes incident had attracted attention from members of Congress who had been pushing for stronger federal oversight of local police departments. A successful prosecution in this case could provide momentum for legislative reforms that would expand federal authority to investigate and prosecute police misconduct. "Mike," Williams said to the U.S. Attorney, "we need to discuss the broader implications of this case. If we're successful, it could establish important precedents for federal prosecution of both individual officers and their supervisors." Davidson nodded, understanding that the case would be closely watched by law enforcement agencies, civil rights organizations, and federal prosecutors across the country. "Pat, I want to make sure we're prepared for the defense arguments. Morrison's attorney will claim that he was acting on legitimate law enforcement concerns." Williams had been anticipating those arguments since the investigation began. "Mike, Morrison's own statements undermine any claim that his actions were based on legitimate law enforcement concerns. He explicitly described his policing philosophy in terms of racial and economic stereotyping." The federal prosecutors spent the remainder of the day reviewing witness statements and planning their prosecution strategy. They had identified more than a dozen individuals who had been stopped or arrested by Morrison under questionable circumstances, providing multiple examples of his discriminatory behavior. Perhaps most importantly, they had Dominique Hayes herself, whose credibility and professional standing would make her a powerful witness for the prosecution. Her status as a high-ranking government official would make it difficult for the defense to attack her character or motivations. As the sun set over Atlanta, Williams stood at the conference room window, looking out over a city that had been shaped by decades of struggle over civil rights and racial justice. The Hayes case represented both how far society had come and how far it still had to go in ensuring equal treatment under the law. The federal investigation had revealed not just Morrison's individual misconduct, but a system of failures that had enabled that misconduct to continue for years. The prosecution would need to address both the individual violations and the institutional problems that had made those violations possible. Williams's final task of the day was to review the draft indictment that her team had prepared. The charges against Morrison included deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony that carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Additional charges were being considered against his supervisors for their failure to investigate credible complaints about his discriminatory behavior. The indictment would mark the beginning of a legal battle that would test not only the specific facts of the Hayes case, but the broader questions of accountability and justice in American law enforcement. The outcome would reverberate far beyond Georgia, influencing how police departments across the country train officers, investigate complaints, and ensure constitutional policing. As Williams prepared to return to Washington to brief her superiors on the investigation's findings, she knew that the Hayes case had the potential to become a landmark in the ongoing effort to ensure that civil rights are protected for all Americans, regardless of their race or the assumptions that others might make about them. The federal courthouse in Atlanta had seen many significant trials over the decades, but few had attracted the level of public attention and media scrutiny that surrounded United States v. Morrison. The limestone columns and marble steps of the building were flanked by television trucks and camera crews from networks across the country, while protesters and supporters gathered behind police barriers that had been erected to maintain order. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Courtroom 8 Amperes had been selected for the trial, not only because of its size, but because of its advanced technology capabilities, which would be necessary to present the complex statistical evidence and electronic records that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Judge Robert Sterling entered the courtroom with the measured dignity that had characterized his 25 years on the federal bench. At 68, Sterling had presided over some of Georgia's most significant civil rights cases, and his reputation for fairness and legal scholarship had made him a respected figure among attorneys on both sides of the ideological spectrum. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced as everyone rose. "The Honorable Judge Sterling presiding in the matter of United States versus Jake Morrison." Sterling surveyed the packed courtroom, taking note of the diverse audience that included civil rights activists, law enforcement officers, government officials, and members of the media. The case had attracted national attention not just because of its specific facts, but because of its broader implications for police accountability and civil rights enforcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling said, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom's sound system, "this trial will address serious allegations of civil rights violations by a law enforcement officer. I expect all participants and observers to conduct themselves with the dignity and respect that these proceedings deserve." At the prosecution table, Assistant Attorney General Patricia Williams sat with her team of federal prosecutors, their briefcases and laptops containing thousands of pages of evidence that they would present over the coming weeks. Williams had spent months preparing for this moment, knowing that the outcome would influence federal civil rights prosecution for years to come. At the defense table, Morrison sat beside his attorney, veteran criminal defense lawyer Richard Hartwell. Hartwell had built his reputation defending police officers accused of misconduct, and he understood the challenges he faced in defending a case with such overwhelming evidence of discriminatory behavior. Morrison himself appeared tense but composed, wearing a dark suit that contrasted sharply with the police uniform he had worn during the incidents that had brought him to this courtroom. The confident swagger that had characterized his behavior during traffic stops had been replaced by the subdued demeanor of someone whose career and freedom were at stake. Judge Sterling turned his attention to the jury selection process, which had taken nearly a week to complete due to the extensive media coverage and the strong opinions that many potential jurors held about police misconduct and racial bias. The final jury consisted of 12 individuals whose backgrounds reflected the diversity of the Atlanta metropolitan area. "Miss Williams," Judge Sterling said, "you may present your opening statement." Williams rose from her chair and approached the jury box with the confident stride of a prosecutor who had built her career on complex civil rights cases. She paused for a moment, making eye contact with each juror before beginning her presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams began, her voice clear and commanding, "this case is about the most fundamental principle of American justice, that all citizens, regardless of their race or appearance, have the right to be treated equally under the law." She gestured toward Morrison, who sat motionless at the defense table. The defendant, Jake Morrison, violated that principle in the most egregious way possible. He used his authority as a police officer to target, harass, and falsely arrest citizens based not on evidence of criminal activity, but on his racial prejudices and stereotypical assumptions. Williams walked to the evidence display that had been set up near the jury box, pointing to a large photograph of Dominique Hayes. On July 15th of last year, Dr. Dominique Hayes was driving home from work when she was stopped by the defendant for an alleged traffic violation. Dr. Hayes is a respected government official, a woman who has devoted her career to public service and improving the systems that serve Georgia's citizens. The prosecutor's voice took on a tone of controlled anger as she described what had happened next. Despite having committed no traffic violation, despite carrying completely legitimate identification, and despite conducting herself with perfect courtesy and cooperation, Dr. Hayes was arrested by the defendant for allegedly possessing fraudulent documents. Williams paused, allowing the absurdity of the situation to sink in with the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hayes was arrested for possessing fake identification documents that she herself had helped design as part of her job with the state government. The irony would be laughable if the violation of her civil rights wasn't so serious. The prosecutor moved to another evidence display, this one showing statistical charts and graphs that illustrated Morrison's pattern of discriminatory policing. But Dr. Hayes's case was not an isolated incident. Over the course of his career, the defendant demonstrated a clear pattern of targeting minority drivers for traffic stops, searches, and arrests at rates that cannot be explained by anything other than racial bias. Williams pointed to specific statistics that showed Morrison's stop rates by race, his search rates, and the outcomes of his arrests. The evidence will show that the defendant stopped black drivers at nearly 8 times the rate of white drivers, searched their vehicles at nearly 10 times the rate, and arrested them for charges that were later dismissed at nearly 15 times the rate. The numbers were stark and undeniable, creating a visual representation of discriminatory policing that would be difficult for any jury to ignore. Williams had learned from experience that statistical evidence could be more powerful than emotional appeals in convincing jurors of systematic bias. Ladies and gentlemen, Williams continued, the defendant will claim that his actions were based on legitimate law enforcement concerns, but you will hear his own words, recorded during official interviews, in which he describes his policing philosophy in terms that can only be described as racial profiling. She approached the jury box, her voice dropping to emphasize the gravity of what she was about to say. The defendant told investigators, and I quote, "You develop instincts about who belongs where and who doesn't. When you see someone driving a car they shouldn't be able to afford, living in a neighborhood they don't belong in, you investigate." The courtroom was completely silent as Williams allowed Morrison's own words to hang in the air. Several jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions showing the impact of hearing the defendant's admission in his own voice. Those words, ladies and gentlemen, are the words of a police officer who had decided that he would judge citizens not by their actions, but by his assumptions about what kind of car they should be driving and what kind of neighborhood they should be living in based on their race. Williams returned to the prosecution table, her opening statement building toward its conclusion. Over the next several weeks, you will hear testimony from Dr. Hayes about her experience, from other citizens who were targeted by the defendant's discriminatory policing, and from experts who will explain how the defendant's behavior violated the constitutional rights that we all share as Americans. She faced the jury directly, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. At the end of this trial, I will ask you to hold the defendant accountable for his actions by finding him guilty of violating the civil rights of Dr. Hayes and others. The evidence will show that he used his badge and his authority not to protect and serve, but to target and oppress based on racial prejudice. Williams returned to her seat as Judge Sterling called for a brief recess before the defense's opening statement. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as spectators and reporters discussed the prosecutor's powerful presentation. When court reconvened, defense attorney Richard Hartwell approached the jury with a different demeanor than the prosecutor had displayed. Where Williams had been commanding and confident, Hartwell appeared more conversational and sympathetic, attempting to connect with jurors on a personal level. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hartwell began, "I want to start by acknowledging that what happened to Dr. Hayes was unfortunate. No one should have to go through the experience of being arrested when they have done nothing wrong." Hartwell's strategy was immediately apparent. He would not try to defend Morrison's actions as correct but would argue that they resulted from reasonable mistakes rather than discriminatory intent. But this case is not about whether Officer Morrison made mistakes in his policing decisions. This case is about whether those mistakes were motivated by racial prejudice and whether they constitute federal crimes that should send a dedicated police officer to prison. Hartwell walked toward Morrison, placing a supportive hand on his client's shoulder. Officer Morrison served his community for 10 years, working nights, weekends, and holidays to keep Georgia's highways safe. He made thousands of traffic stops, conducted hundreds of investigations, and arrested countless individuals who were actually breaking the law. The defense attorney moved to his own evidence display, which showed Morrison's commendations and positive performance evaluations. The prosecution wants you to focus on a handful of controversial stops out of thousands of legitimate law enforcement actions. They want you to see malice where there was simply the kind of human error that occurs in any high-pressure job. Hartwell's voice took on a more personal tone as he addressed the jury directly. Officer Morrison is not a racist. He is a dedicated public servant who made decisions based on his training and experience, not on the race of the individuals he encountered. The defense attorney returned to the Morrison statements that the prosecution had highlighted, attempting to reframe them in a more sympathetic light. When Officer Morrison talked about developing instincts about suspicious behavior, he was describing the kind of street-level knowledge that all experienced police officers develop through years of training and experience. Hartwell paused, allowing his alternative interpretation to register with the jury. The prosecution has taken Officer Morrison's words out of context, twisting legitimate law enforcement observations into evidence of racial bias that simply doesn't exist. The defense attorney's closing was brief but pointed. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to look beyond the prosecution's statistics and emotional appeals to consider the human being who sits before you. Officer Morrison dedicated his career to protecting the public, and he deserves better than to have his mistakes criminalized by federal prosecutors seeking to make a political point. As both sides concluded their opening statements, the stage was set for a trial that would examine not only the specific incidents involving Morrison, but the broader questions of racial bias in policing and the federal government's role in ensuring constitutional rights. Judge Sterling addressed the courtroom as the first day of testimony approached. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin hearing evidence tomorrow morning. I remind all participants that this trial will be conducted with the dignity and respect that the serious issues before us demand. The courtroom emptied slowly as spectators, reporters, and participants filed out into the Atlanta evening. The battle lines had been drawn, the opening arguments presented, and the stage set for a legal confrontation that would test fundamental questions about justice, equality, and accountability in American law enforcement. For Morrison, the trial represented the potential end of his career and his freedom. For the prosecution, it represented an opportunity to establish important precedents for federal civil rights enforcement. For the broader public, it represented a test of whether the justice system would hold police officers accountable for discriminatory behavior that violated the constitutional rights of American citizens. The fluorescent lights dimmed in the empty courtroom as security guards prepared to lock the building for the night. Tomorrow would bring the first witnesses, the first evidence, and the first real test of whether justice would prevail in one of the most significant civil rights cases in recent Georgia history. The second day of trial dawned gray and humid, typical of Atlanta's oppressive summer weather, but inside the climate-controlled federal courthouse, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Word had spread that the prosecution would begin presenting their case with testimony from Dominique Hayes herself, and the courtroom gallery was packed with an even larger crowd than had attended the opening statements. Dominique sat in the witness waiting room, reviewing her notes one final time with Assistant Attorney General Williams. Despite her extensive experience in high-pressure government meetings and policy presentations, she felt the weight of this moment differently. This wasn't about budgets or administrative procedures. This was about justice, dignity, and the fundamental rights that defined American society. "Dominique," Williams said quietly, "remember that you're not just testifying for yourself today. You're representing every person who has been subjected to the kind of treatment that Morrison inflicted on you." Dominique nodded, straightening her navy blazer and checking her appearance one final time. She had chosen her outfit carefully. Professional but not ostentatious. Authoritative but not intimidating. Every detail mattered in a trial where perceptions could influence the jury's understanding of what had happened on that July afternoon. "Miss Williams," the bailiff announced, appearing in the doorway, "Judge Sterling is ready for your first witness." The courtroom fell silent as Dominique entered and walked toward the witness stand. She moved with the same composed dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout the investigation, her posture straight and her expression calm. As she took the oath and settled into the witness chair, she could feel the weight of every gaze in the courtroom. From the jurors to the media representatives to Officer Morrison himself. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Williams began, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. "My name is Dominique Hayes, and I am the Director of Policy Development for the Georgia Department of Driver Services." Williams approached the witness stand with deliberate steps, establishing the foundation that would make Dominique's testimony so powerful. "Miss Hayes, can you describe your professional background and your role with the state government?" Dominique turned slightly toward the jury, her voice steady and professional. "I have worked for the state of Georgia for 15 years, starting as a policy analyst and advancing to my current position. My responsibilities include overseeing the development and implementation of policies related to driver's licenses, identification documents, and vehicle registration systems." "Miss Hayes, are you familiar with the security features that are built into Georgia driver's licenses?" "I am intimately familiar with them. I personally supervise the implementation of many of the current security features, including the holographic overlays, microprinting, and embedded security threads that make our licenses among the most fraud-resistant in the nation." Williams retrieved a plastic evidence bag from the prosecution table, holding it up so the jury could see its contents. "Miss Hayes, I'm showing you what has been marked as Government Exhibit 1. Can you identify this document?" Dominique examined the driver's license through the clear plastic bag, recognizing it immediately as the license that Morrison had claimed was fraudulent. "This is my Georgia driver's license, issued last year when I renewed it." "Miss Hayes, in your professional opinion, is this license genuine?" "Absolutely. This license contains every security feature that the state of Georgia incorporates into its identification documents. It was produced using equipment that costs millions of dollars and is available only to authorized government facilities." Williams had established the foundation she needed. Dominique was not just a victim of Morrison's misconduct, but the very expert who could authenticate the documents that Morrison had claimed were fraudulent. The irony was not lost on the jury, several of whom were taking notes. As she testified, "Miss Hayes, I'd like to take you back to July 15th of last year. Can you describe the events of that day?" Dominique took a breath, her mind returning to the afternoon that had changed her life. "I was driving home from work, traveling on Interstate 285. I had stopped briefly to check my phone for directions when I was approached by Officer Morrison." Williams guided Dominique through her testimony methodically, establishing each element of what had occurred during the traffic stop. The jury listened intently as Dominique described Morrison's aggressive demeanor, his immediate suspicion about her vehicle and appearance, and his escalation of a routine encounter into a humiliating arrest. Miss Hayes, when Officer Morrison first approached your vehicle, what was your reaction? I was confused because I knew I hadn't committed any traffic violation. I had my license, registration, and insurance ready, and I tried to cooperate fully with his requests. Did Officer Morrison explain why he had stopped you? Dominique's voice carried a note of frustration as she recalled the encounter. He claimed I had failed to signal properly for my exit, but I knew that wasn't true. I always signal appropriately, and I had been driving the same route for 15 years. Williams moved closer to the witness stand, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Miss Hayes, can you describe Officer Morrison's demeanor during this encounter? From the beginning, Officer Morrison seemed suspicious and hostile. He examined my license with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light and commenting that something didn't look right about it. Did you try to explain to Officer Morrison that your license was genuine? I did. I told him that my license had been issued just the previous month and that I could provide additional identification if necessary. But he seemed to have already made up his mind that it was fraudulent. Williams retrieved another piece of evidence from the prosecution table, a transcript of Morrison's recorded statements. Miss Hayes, did Officer Morrison make any comments about your vehicle or your appearance? Dominique's expression tightened as she recalled the most hurtful aspects of the encounter. He questioned how I could afford the car I was driving and suggested that my appearance was inconsistent with legitimate employment. The courtroom stirred at this testimony, and several jurors looked toward Morrison with expressions of disapproval. Williams pressed forward, knowing that this was the heart of her case. Miss Hayes, when Officer Morrison made these comments, how did they make you feel? Defense Attorney Hartwell rose from his chair. Objection, Your Honor. The witness's feelings are not relevant to whether a federal crime was committed. Judge Sterling considered the objection carefully. Overruled. The witness may answer. Dominique looked directly at the jury as she responded. I felt humiliated and degraded. Here was a police officer making assumptions about my legitimacy as a person based on nothing more than my race and his preconceptions about what I should be driving. Williams allowed the impact of that statement to register with the jury before continuing. Miss Hayes, what happened when Officer Morrison decided to arrest you? He told me I was under arrest for possessing fraudulent identification documents. When I protested that my license was completely legitimate, he became more aggressive and accused me of lying to a police officer. The prosecutor walked to the jury box, her voice rising with controlled indignation. Miss Hayes, as the person who helped design the very security features that appear on your driver's license, what was your reaction to being arrested for possessing a fake ID? I was shocked by the absurdity of it, but I was also frightened. I realized that Officer Morrison had made up his mind about me from the moment he saw me, and no amount of evidence or explanation was going to change his perception. Williams returned to the evidence table and retrieved a folder containing Morrison's training records. Miss Hayes, are you aware that Officer Morrison had completed multiple bias awareness training sessions over the course of his career? I became aware of that during the investigation, yes. In your professional experience working with law enforcement agencies, what is the purpose of bias awareness training? Hartwell rose again. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is not qualified to testify about law enforcement training practices. Williams responded immediately. Your Honor, Miss Hayes has worked closely with law enforcement agencies throughout her career and has participated in the development of training materials for officers who handle identification documents. Overruled, Sterling. Decided. The witness may answer. Dominique turned toward the jury. The witness may answer. Bias awareness training is designed to help officers recognize their own unconscious prejudices and make decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. The fact that Officer Morrison had received such training multiple times makes his behavior even more troubling. Williams had been building toward this moment throughout Dominique's testimony. Miss Hayes, based on your experience in this encounter with Officer Morrison, what do you believe motivated his decision to stop and arrest you? Hartwell was on his feet again. Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation about the defendant's state of mind, Williams countered quickly. Your Honor, Miss Hayes is testifying about her own experience and observations during the encounter. Sterling nodded. I'll allow it. But please be careful about speculation, Miss Williams. Dominique looked directly at Morrison as she answered. I believe Officer Morrison stopped me because he saw a black woman driving an expensive car and assumed that I must be doing something illegal. His decision to arrest me was based not on evidence of any crime, but on his inability to accept that I could legitimately afford the lifestyle I was living. The courtroom was completely silent as the weight of Dominique's testimony settled over the jury. Williams had accomplished exactly what she had intended. She had presented Morrison's victim not as someone seeking revenge, but as a professional woman whose dignity had been attacked by an officer's racial prejudices. Miss Hayes, what impact has this incident had on your life? It has been devastating in ways that go beyond the immediate humiliation. I've dedicated my career to public service, to making government systems work better for all citizens. To have my legitimacy questioned by a police officer based solely on my race has shaken my faith in the very systems I've worked to improve. Williams approached the witness stand one final time. Hayes, why did you decide to pursue federal charges against Officer Morrison? Dominique's voice carried the conviction that had driven her throughout her career. Because what happened to me happens to countless other people who don't have the resources or platform to fight back. If someone in my position can be treated this way, imagine what happens to people who don't have my advantages. Williams returned to the prosecution table, satisfied that she had established the foundation for her case. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Sterling turned toward the defense table. Mr. Hartwell, you may cross-examine the witness. Hartwell approached the witness stand with the careful demeanor of an attorney who knew he was walking into dangerous territory. Attacking Dominique's credibility would be difficult given her professional standing, but he needed to create doubt about her interpretation of Morrison's motives. Miss Hayes, you testified that you believed Officer Morrison stopped you because of your race. But isn't it possible that he genuinely believed there was something suspicious about your properties? License? Dominique's response was immediate and firm. Mr. Hartwell, my license was perfect in every detail. There was nothing suspicious about it except Officer Morrison's assumption that someone who looked like me couldn't legitimately possess it. Hartwell tried a different approach. Miss Hayes, you've testified that Officer Morrison's behavior was motivated by racial bias. But you can't actually read his mind, can you? I don't need to read his mind, Mr. Hartwell. I can listen to his words and observe his actions. When an officer tells someone that they're driving a car they can't afford and living beyond their means, that's not law enforcement. That's prejudice. The cross-examination continued for another hour, but Hartwell was unable to shake Dominique's testimony or create significant doubt about her version of events. Her professional demeanor and detailed recollection of the encounter made her a formidable witness who could not be easily discredited. When Dominique finally stepped down from the witness stand, she had accomplished something remarkable. She had transformed a humiliating personal experience into a powerful indictment of discriminatory policing that resonated with every person in the courtroom. The prosecution's next witness was Terrence Johnson, the attorney who had been arrested by Morrison 18 months before the Hayes incident under remarkably similar circumstances. Johnson's testimony would establish that Dominique's experience was not isolated but part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior. "Johnson," Williams began, "please describe your encounter with Officer Morrison in January of last year." Johnson, a distinguished man in his early 40s, settled into the witness chair with the composure of someone accustomed to courtroom proceedings. "I was driving home from my law office when Officer Morrison stopped me for allegedly exceeding the speed limit. When I provided my driver's license, he claimed it looked suspicious and arrested me for possessing false identification." "Mr. Johnson, was your license actually fraudulent?" "Absolutely not. It was completely legitimate, issued by the state of Georgia just 6 months earlier." Williams guided Johnson through his testimony, establishing the similarities between his experience and Dominique's. The pattern was unmistakable. Morrison had targeted successful black professionals, driving expensive vehicles, manufacturing reasons to stop them, and then escalating minor encounters into arrests based on fabricated suspicions about fraudulent documents. "Mr. Johnson, did you file a complaint about Officer Morrison's conduct?" "I did. I contacted the Georgia State Patrol and filed a formal complaint alleging racial profiling." "What was the department's response to your complaint?" Johnson's expression showed his frustration with the process. "I was told that Officer Morrison would receive additional bias awareness training and that the matter would be handled internally. When I asked for follow-up information, I was told that personnel matters were confidential." The testimony established another crucial element of the prosecution's case: the department's failure to properly investigate credible complaints about Morrison's discriminatory behavior had enabled him to continue targeting minority drivers. Williams called several more witnesses throughout the day, each providing pieces of the larger puzzle that demonstrated Morrison's pattern of biased policing. The statistical evidence, the witness testimony, and Morrison's own recorded statements combined to create an overwhelming case for federal civil rights violations. As the court adjourned for the day, Morrison sat at the defense table looking increasingly isolated and defeated. The prosecution had methodically dismantled any claim that his actions were based on legitimate law enforcement concerns, revealing instead a pattern of discriminatory behavior that violated the constitutional rights of American citizens. Judge Sterling addressed the courtroom as the day concluded. "We will resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, with continued testimony from prosecution witnesses." The spectators and media representatives filed out of the courtroom, many of them discussing the powerful testimony they had heard. The prosecution had established not just the facts of what had occurred, but the broader context that made Morrison's actions a violation of federal civil rights law. For Dominique, the day had been both emotionally draining and deeply satisfying. She had told her story with dignity and precision, transforming her victimization into a powerful tool for justice. The legal system that had failed to protect her from Morrison's discrimination was now being used to hold him accountable for his actions. The trial was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a conviction that would send a clear message about the consequences of using a police badge to target citizens based on racial prejudice and stereotypical assumptions. 3 weeks after the trial began, the federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with an electricity that seemed to charge the very air. The jury had been deliberating for 8 hours over 2 days, and word had spread throughout the legal community that a verdict was imminent. The hallways filled with reporters, civil rights activists, law enforcement officials, and ordinary citizens who understood that the outcome of United States v. Morrison would resonate far beyond the courtroom where it was decided. Inside the jury room, 12 citizens from diverse backgrounds had spent hours wrestling with questions that went to the heart of American justice. The evidence had been overwhelming. Statistical analysis showing Morrison's pattern of discriminatory stops, testimony from multiple victims describing similar experiences, and Morrison's own recorded statements revealing his biased assumptions about race and class. Jury foreman David Mitchell, a retired engineer who had spent his career solving complex problems, looked around the table at his fellow jurors. They had reached their decision unanimously, understanding that their verdict would send a message about whether the federal justice system would hold police officers accountable for violating the constitutional rights of American citizens. "Are we all in agreement?" Mitchell asked, receiving nods from every juror around the table. The bailiff knocked on the jury room door at precisely 3:47 p.m., announcing that Judge Sterling was ready to receive their verdict. The jurors filed into the courtroom with the solemn dignity of citizens who had discharged one of democracy's most important responsibilities. Judge Sterling surveyed the packed courtroom before addressing the jury foreman. "Mr. Mitchell, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." Sterling nodded toward the court clerk, who rose to receive the verdict forms from the jury foreman. The courtroom was so quiet that the rustle of paper seemed amplified as the clerk handed the documents to the judge. Sterling reviewed the verdicts carefully before returning them to the clerk to be read aloud. The moment stretched endlessly as everyone in the courtroom held their breath, understanding that they were about to witness a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for civil rights and police accountability. "In the matter of United States versus Jake Morrison," the clerk began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "on the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and quiet celebration. Judge Sterling's gavel struck repeatedly as he called for order, but the emotional release was unstoppable. Dominique Hayes sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she felt the weight of vindication and justice, finally delivered. The clerk continued reading additional counts related to Morrison's pattern of discriminatory policing, each one resulting in a guilty verdict that further sealed his fate. By the time all verdicts had been read, Morrison had been convicted on 7 federal counts that carried a potential sentence of up to 70 years in prison. Morrison sat at the defense table in stunned silence, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as the reality of his situation sank in. The confident police officer who had made the traffic stop that started this legal odyssey had been transformed into a convicted felon, facing the destruction of everything he had worked to build over his 10-year career. Judge Sterling addressed the courtroom as the initial reaction to the verdicts began to subside. "Ladies and gentlemen, this trial has addressed serious questions about the constitutional rights of all Americans and the responsibility of law enforcement officers to protect those rights equally." He turned toward Morrison, his expression grave. "Mr. Morrison, you have been found guilty of violating your oath as a police officer and the constitutional rights of American citizens. Sentencing will take place in 30 days, during which time a pre-sentence investigation will be conducted." Sterling continued, addressing the broader implications of the case. "This verdict sends a clear message that federal authorities will not tolerate the use of police powers to discriminate against citizens based on race, ethnicity, or any other protected characteristic." Outside the courthouse, the scene resembled a political rally as civil rights leaders, community activists, and supporters of police accountability gathered to celebrate the verdict. Isaiah Coleman, Dominique's civil attorney, stood at a podium surrounded by microphones and cameras, preparing to address the media crowd that had assembled. "Today, Justice has been served not just for Dominique Hayes, but for every American who has been subjected to discriminatory policing, Coleman declared, his voice carrying across the crowd. This verdict proves that no one, including police officers, is above the law when it comes to constitutional rights. Coleman gestured toward Dominique, who stood beside him with the composed dignity that had characterized her throughout the entire ordeal. Dr. Hayes could have chosen to remain silent about her experience, to handle this matter quietly through administrative channels. Instead, she chose to fight for justice, knowing that her case could help prevent similar violations from happening to others. Dominique stepped to the microphone, her voice steady despite the emotional impact of the day's events. This verdict is not about revenge or animosity toward law enforcement. It's about accountability and the principle that all Americans, regardless of their race or appearance, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect by those sworn to protect and serve. She paused, looking out over the crowd of supporters and media representatives. I hope that this case will encourage other victims of discriminatory policing to come forward, and that it will inspire law enforcement agencies to take meaningful action to prevent bias from corrupting their operations. The impact of the Morrison conviction rippled through law enforcement agencies across Georgia beyond. Police departments began reviewing their training programs, complaint procedures, and statistical monitoring systems to identify and address potential patterns of discriminatory behavior before they resulted in federal intervention. Captain Linda Foster, Morrison's former supervisor, submitted her resignation 2 days after the verdict, acknowledging in her resignation letter that she had failed to properly investigate complaints about Morrison's conduct. Deputy Commissioner Harold Stone announced a comprehensive review of the department's supervisory procedures and complaint handling processes. The Georgia State Patrol issued a statement expressing regret for Morrison's actions and outlining reforms that would be implemented to prevent similar incidents. The reforms included enhanced bias awareness training, statistical monitoring of officer stops and searches, and an independent review process for complaints alleging discriminatory policing. 30 days later, Morrison returned to Judge Sterling's courtroom for sentencing. The pre-sentence investigation had revealed additional details about his pattern of discriminatory behavior, including complaints that had been filed but not properly investigated by his supervisors. Mr. Morrison, Judge Sterling said as the defendant stood before him, you have been convicted of serious violations of federal civil rights law. Your actions not only harmed individual victims but undermined public trust in law enforcement and violated the oath you took to serve and protect all citizens equally. Sterling reviewed the sentencing guidelines and the factors that would influence his decision. While I recognize that you have no prior criminal record and that you served as a police officer for 10 years, I cannot ignore the severity of your crimes or their impact on the victims and the community. The judge's voice carried the weight of federal authority as he announced Morrison's sentence. Jake Morrison, you are hereby sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are also permanently barred from employment in law enforcement and ordered to pay restitution to your victims. The sentence was longer than many observers had expected, reflecting the seriousness with which the federal judiciary viewed civil rights violations by police officers. Morrison's attorney immediately announced plans to appeal, but legal experts suggested that the overwhelming evidence and unanimous jury verdict made a successful appeal unlikely. The civil lawsuit that Isaiah Coleman had filed on Dominique's behalf was settled 6 months later for an undisclosed amount that sources suggested was in the 7-figure range. More importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring the Georgia State Patrol to implement comprehensive reforms in training, supervision, and complaint investigation. The broader impact of the Morrison case extended far beyond Georgia's borders. Federal prosecutors in other jurisdictions began reviewing similar cases with renewed interest, using the Morrison precedent to pursue charges against officers who had previously escaped accountability for discriminatory behavior. Law enforcement training academies across the country began incorporating the Morrison case into their curricula as an example of how racial bias could lead to criminal prosecution and the destruction of police careers. The case became a cautionary tale that was studied in police departments from coast to coast. For Dominique Hayes, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked not an end, but a beginning. She became a sought-after speaker at conferences on civil rights and police accountability, using her experience to advocate for reforms that would prevent other citizens from experiencing the discrimination she had faced. The Morrison case proved that our system of justice can work when citizens are willing to stand up for their rights and when prosecutors are willing to hold law enforcement accountable, Dominique told a gathering of civil rights attorneys. But it also showed how much work remains to be done to ensure that all Americans are treated equally under the law. She continued her work with the Georgia Department of Driver Services, but her role had evolved to include consulting with other states on anti-fraud measures and bias prevention in document verification. Her expertise, gained through both professional experience and personal victimization, made her uniquely qualified to help improve identification systems while protecting civil rights. The courthouse steps, where Coleman had announced the verdict, became a gathering place for other victims of police discrimination who saw the Morrison case as proof that the justice system could work for them as well. Civil rights organizations reported increased reporting of discriminatory policing incidents and greater willingness by victims to pursue legal remedies. 3 years after Morrison began serving his federal sentence, Dominique received a letter forwarded through the prison system. The letter was brief and handwritten, expressing Morrison's recognition that his actions had been wrong and his regret for the harm he had caused. Dominique read the letter twice before filing it away, understanding that Morrison's acknowledgement of wrongdoing was important for his own rehabilitation, but could not undo the damage his actions had caused. The letter represented a personal closure to a case that had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated on that July afternoon when their paths first crossed. The Morrison case had proven that the arc of the moral universe, however slowly, did bend toward justice. A racist cop had laughed at a black woman's fake identification, not knowing that she had written the very policies that governed those documents. His laughter had been silenced by the verdict of 12 citizens who understood that constitutional rights belong to all Americans, regardless of race or the assumptions that others might make about them. In the end, the truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and a system had been forced to confront its own failures and commit to doing better. The wheels of justice had turned slowly, but they had turned decisively toward accountability, equality, and the protection of rights that define American democracy at its best. The story of Dominique Hayes and Jake Morrison became more than a case study in police misconduct. It became a testament to the power of individual courage, institutional accountability, and a justice system that, when properly functioning, can protect the rights of all citizens equally under the law.